Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The day we found the first note taped to our front door was actually my daughter Lily's 7th birthday, October of 2018, and we'd only been in the house for 3 weeks. My wife Jennifer and I had scraped together everything we had for the down payment on this place in Rosewood Heights, a suburb about 40 minutes outside the city. It was supposed to be our fresh start, you know. After years of cramped apartment living with paper-thin walls and neighbors who argued every night, we finally had our own little piece of the American dream. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, an actual backyard where Lily could play. That morning, I'd gone out to grab the newspaper while Jen was making pancakes shaped like butterflies. And there it was, a folded piece of notebook paper stuck right at eye level with silver duct tape. The message was written in blue ballpoint pen, the handwriting neat but somehow aggressive, like whoever wrote it was pressing down hard enough to nearly tear through the paper. Your kind doesn't belong here. Consider this your only warning. That's all it said. No signature, no explanation of what your kind meant. Jennifer thought maybe it was meant for the previous owners. The Nguyens had mentioned getting some cold shoulders when they'd first moved in 5 years ago. But something about finding it on Lily's birthday made my chest tight with this weird dread. I stuffed it in my pocket before going back inside, not wanting to ruin the butterfly pancakes and the excitement about the bounce house we'd rented for her party that afternoon. 20 kids were coming over, half her 2nd grade class, and I kept telling myself it was probably just some bored teenager trying to mess with the new family. The party went perfectly until around 4 in the afternoon. Kids were bouncing, screaming with joy, their faces painted like tigers and superheroes, when I noticed someone standing at the edge of our property line. It was this older guy, maybe in his 60s, wearing a faded green windbreaker despite the warm weather. He had this gray stubble that looked like he hadn't shaved in exactly 3 days, and these watery blue eyes that never blinked once while I watched him. He was just standing there next to our mailbox, not on the sidewalk, but specifically on that little strip of grass between the curb and the pavement. His hands were in his pockets, and he was watching the kids play with this expression I couldn't read. Not quite angry, not quite sad, just intensely focused. When I walked toward him to ask if I could help him with something, he turned and walked away, without changing his pace, like he'd been planning to leave at that exact moment anyway. That night, after all the kids had gone home and we'd stuffed ourselves with leftover pizza and cake, I was breaking down the bounce house when I heard it. Footsteps in the side yard, right outside our bedroom window. Not the quick scurrying of a raccoon or the neighbor's cat, but deliberate, measured steps on the gravel we just had put in. Each crunch was spaced exactly the same distance apart, like someone was pacing. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the garage and went outside, but whoever it was had already gone. The motion sensor light was still on though, and in the fresh gravel, I could see footprints leading from the gate to our bedroom window and back. Size 11 or 12 men's boots with a distinctive worn pattern on the heel. Jennifer wanted to call the police right then, but what would we say? Someone walked through our yard? They'd probably just tell us to get better locks or adopt a dog. The second note came 3 days later, stuffed into the gap between our car's hood and windshield while we slept. This time it was typed, printed on regular computer paper. You were warned. Every day you stay is another day closer to consequences you can't imagine. We know your routines. We know when you leave for work at 7:47. We know when your wife takes your daughter to gymnastics on Wednesdays. We know which window you forget to lock. That last part made Jennifer grab my arm so hard she left nail marks. Our bathroom window, the small one above the shower, the lock had been broken since we moved in and we kept forgetting to call someone to fix it. We'd mentioned it to exactly nobody, not even the home inspector who'd missed it. Whoever wrote this had been inside our house, or at least tried to get in through that window enough times to know the lock didn't catch properly. We installed cameras that same day. Nothing fancy, just those wireless ones you can monitor from your phone. The guy at Best Buy recommended a 8-camera system that would cover every angle of the property. While I was up on the ladder mounting one above the garage, I noticed our neighbor across the street, a woman named Dottie who'd brought us cookies when we first moved in, standing in her driveway talking to the man in the green windbreaker. They kept glancing at our house while they talked, and Dottie was nodding along to whatever he was saying, her arms crossed tight against her chest. When she saw me watching, she quickly went inside, but the man stayed there for another full minute, just staring at me on my ladder. He had this weird half-smirk, like he knew something I didn't. That night, reviewing the camera footage from earlier, I saw him again at 3:47 a.m., standing at the very edge of where our property met the sidewalk, just outside the camera's motion detection range. He stood there for exactly 1 hour, never moving except to occasionally check his watch. Jennifer started keeping Lily home from school after the third note appeared. This one slid under our front door while we were all inside eating dinner. We actually heard it, the soft whisper of paper on hardwood, and I ran to the door fast enough to hear footsteps running away, but by the time I got outside, the street was empty. The note was different this time, handwritten again, but in red ink. The Nguyens were smart to leave. You should have asked them why. Your daughter has such pretty hair. She shouldn't walk to the bus stop alone. That's when Jennifer broke down completely. She'd been trying to stay strong, but the mention of Lily destroyed her. The thing is, Lily had only walked to the bus stop alone once, the very first day of school before we knew the routine. After that, one of us always went with her. Whoever was doing this had been watching us from the very beginning, from our first day in this house. I took time off work and started doing my own investigation. I talked to neighbors, but most of them acted strange when I brought up the notes. Not suspicious exactly, more like uncomfortable, looking away and making excuses to end the conversation. Only one person would actually talk to me, Paul, an elderly man who lived 3 houses down and spent most of his time tending to his rose garden. He invited me into his garage, away from the street, and told me in this hushed voice that the same thing had happened to 3 other families on our street over the past 10 years. All of them had moved in from out of state. All of them had young children, and all of them had left within 6 months. He said there was a group, maybe 4 or 5 people, who'd decided that our street should stay unchanged. They called themselves concerned citizens, but Paul said they were nothing but bullies who'd gotten bolder over the years because nobody ever stood up to them. The man in the green windbreaker was named Walter, and he was supposedly the worst of them, someone who'd lost his job as a security guard for being too aggressive, and now spent all his time protecting the neighborhood. That night, things escalated beyond just notes and lurking. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of breaking glass from downstairs. I grabbed the bat and my phone, telling Jennifer to lock the bedroom door behind me and call 911. The living room window was shattered, and there was a brick on our floor wrapped in another note. But this time I saw them. 2 figures running through our backyard, caught perfectly on the camera footage. One was Walter in his green windbreaker, and the other was a younger man, maybe mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap. The police actually came this time, took the brick as evidence, and said they'd increase patrols. But the officer, a guy named Brennan, pulled me aside and said something that chilled me more than any note could. He said Walter's brother-in-law worked in the department, and while he'd file the report properly, I shouldn't expect much to come from it. He suggested, off the record, that maybe we should consider moving for our family's safety. The next morning, I found Jennifer in Lily's room, packing her clothes into suitcases. She'd already called her sister in Colorado, and they were leaving that afternoon whether I came with them or not. I couldn't blame her. Lily had started having nightmares, wetting the bed for the first time in 3 years, and constantly asking why the mean man kept standing outside. But something in me snapped. We'd done everything right, saved for years, found this perfect house with the good schools and the safe streets, and now these bastards thought they could just drive us out. I told Jennifer to take Lily to her sister's for a few weeks, that I'd handle this. She looked at me like I was insane, but she also knew that look in my eyes. Before they left, I installed more cameras inside the house, changed all the locks to smart locks that would alert my phone if anyone tried to tamper with them, and then I did something that probably wasn't entirely legal. I put a GPS tracker on Walter's car when I saw it parked outside the grocery store. The tracker revealed something interesting. Every night around 11 p.m., Walter would meet with the same 3 people at a house 2 streets over. The house belonged to someone named Gregory Hoffman, according to property records, a retired insurance adjuster who'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. I started documenting everything obsessively, every movement, every meeting, every time one of them drove past my house. On the 4th night alone in the house, I watched through my cameras as Walter tried to jimmy open our newly reinforced back door at 3 a.m. What he didn't know was that I was awake, recording everything on multiple devices, and I'd already called Paul to come over as a witness. When Walter couldn't get in, he stood in our backyard and urinated on Jennifer's garden, the small vegetable patch she'd been so proud of. That's when I knew these people weren't just trying to scare us away. They were enjoying the power, the control, the ability to terrorize a family without consequences. I spent the next day at the law library downtown, researching everything I could about harassment, stalking, and conspiracy laws in our state. I also found something interesting in old newspaper archives. Gregory Hoffman had been sued twice in the past 15 years for harassment, though both cases were settled out of court. One of the families who'd sued him was Vietnamese, the other was black. The pattern was clear. That evening I did something I never thought I'd do. I posted everything online. Every video, every note, every piece of evidence, along with Walter and Gregory's full names and photos from my security cameras. I posted it on the neighborhood Facebook page, Nextdoor, Twitter, and sent it to our local news station. Within 3 hours, the post had been shared over 500 times. People were outraged, especially when they saw the video of Walter trying to break into our house. By midnight, there were news vans parked outside, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Walter's face was on the morning news with the headline, "Neighborhood Watch or Neighborhood Stalkers." The police suddenly became very interested in taking our case seriously when reporters started asking them why they hadn't arrested anyone, after we'd provided clear video evidence of attempted breaking and entering. Walter was arrested the next afternoon, not just for our case, but because 2 other families came forward after seeing the news coverage. They'd been too scared to report their experiences before, but now they had support. Gregory Hoffman and 2 others were charged with conspiracy to commit harassment and making terroristic threats. The FBI even got involved when they found a WhatsApp group where these 4 had been coordinating their campaign not just against us, but against 6 other families over the years. The messages were disgusting, detailed plans about how to escalate the intimidation, jokes about making children cry, and celebrations when families finally moved away. Walter's brother-in-law in the police department was suspended pending investigation. Dottie, our neighbor who'd brought us cookies, came over crying and apologizing, saying she'd been terrified of them too, and only talked to Walter that day because he'd threatened to target her grandson if she didn't provide information about us. Jennifer and Lily came home 2 weeks later, after all 4 men had been formally charged, and Walter was denied bail due to being considered a flight risk. The neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow. People started talking to each other again, having block parties, watching out for each other in the right way. We ended up staying in that house for 5 more years, until I got a job offer in another state that was too good to pass up. But we left on our own terms, not because some pathetic bullies thought they could decide who belonged and who didn't. Paul, the elderly neighbor with the roses, became like a grandfather to Lily. He passed away last year, but before he did, he told me that standing up to Walter's group was the bravest thing he'd seen anyone do in 40 years of living on that street. I don't know about brave. I was just a father who refused to let anyone make his family feel unsafe in their own home. Sometimes that's all it takes, you know? One person who won't back down, who documents everything, and who realizes that sunlight really is the best disinfectant for this kind of poisonous behavior. The garage door wouldn't budge at first, stuck after who knows how many years of neglect. I remember putting my whole weight into it, sweating in the June heat while my wife Claire unpacked boxes inside our new house. We'd just gotten the keys that morning, a fixer-upper on 2 acres of Oregon forest, 40 minutes from Portland where we both taught high school. The property had been sitting empty for 6 months after the previous owner, Frank Garrison, died with no family to inherit it. The bank practically threw the place at us when we made an offer, probably relieved to get it off their books. Everything about the house screamed project: the 70s kitchen, the questionable plumbing, the jungle that used to be a lawn. But we were excited, you know? After years of cramming our lives into a 1-bedroom apartment, this felt like freedom. That Saturday morning, while Claire tackled the mountain of boxes in the living room, I decided to explore the detached garage, fantasizing about finally having space for a workshop. When the door finally gave way and rolled up with a metallic shriek, I got hit with that familiar smell of old oil and dust. The place was exactly what you'd expect: pegboards with rusty tools, towers of soggy cardboard boxes, a riding mower that belonged in a museum. I started making my way through the junk, mentally cataloging what could stay and what needed to go. The back wall had this massive metal shelving unit, the industrial kind you see in warehouses, loaded with paint cans and mysterious jars. Something made me want to check behind it, maybe hoping for more storage space. That's when I saw it. A door, painted the same dingy white as the walls, almost perfectly camouflaged except for one detail that made my chest tighten. While everything else in that garage looked decades old, the padlock securing this door was brand new. Heavy-duty, still shiny. Someone had installed it recently, maybe within the last year. I called Claire over, and we both stood there staring at this door neither of us remembered from the house tour. The realtor had rushed us through the garage. I remembered that much, keeping us focused on the potential of the main house. Claire grabbed a crowbar from the tool pile while I found a hammer, and together we worked on the lock's mounting bracket. The screws were long, biting deep into the wood frame, and whoever installed them hadn't messed around. These were meant to keep people out. After 20 minutes of prying and cursing, the bracket finally came loose with a crack that echoed through the empty garage. The door swung inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not mold or decay like the rest of the garage, but something else. Body odor, stale food, that particular funk of an unventilated space where someone's been living. Claire covered her nose while I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, and when the beam cut through the darkness, we both took an involuntary step backward. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, no windows, just bare wooden walls and a concrete floor. But it wasn't empty. Far from it. A sleeping bag lay unrolled in the corner, the fabric still holding the depression of a body. Next to it, neat rows of canned goods lined a makeshift shelf made from cinder blocks and planks. Beans, soup, ravioli, all with dates from just a few weeks ago. A battery-powered lantern sat on an overturned milk crate that served as a table, alongside a stack of paperback novels, their pages swollen with humidity. Men's clothes hung from nails hammered into the walls, flannel shirts, work pants, thermal underwear. A razor and toothbrush rested in a cup by a water jug. But what made my skin prickle was the notebook on the sleeping bag, filled with dates and times, observations written in cramped handwriting. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read entries about the house, when lights turned on and off, when cars left the driveway, when Frank Garrison had his heart attack in the kitchen. The last entry was from 5 days ago. New people coming tomorrow, need to be ready. Claire grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we backed out of that room like it might explode. My mind was racing, trying to process what we'd just found. Someone had been living in our garage, no, not our garage, Frank Garrison's garage. Watching the house, documenting every movement. The dates in that notebook went back almost 4 months, starting just after Frank's death. This person, whoever they were, had been here through the entire sales process, through every showing, every inspection. They'd watched us tour the property, sign papers, celebrate getting the keys. And according to that last entry, they knew we were moving in. Claire was already dialing 911 while I stood guard at the garage door, half expecting someone to come charging out of the woods. The operator kept us on the line until 2 sheriff's deputies arrived 15 minutes later, though it felt like hours. Deputy Briggs, a tall woman with graying hair, took the lead while her partner photographed everything in the hidden room. They searched the property for 3 hours, checking the tree line, the old shed out back, even the crawl space under the house. Briggs told us squatters weren't uncommon in rural properties, especially ones that sat empty for months. But this felt different from simple squatting, too organized, too focused on surveillance. She bagged the notebook as evidence and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without catching someone in the act, there wasn't much they could do. Before leaving, she helped us install a new padlock on the room and gave us her direct number. That night, neither of us slept much. Every cricket chirp sounded like footsteps. Every tree branch scraping the roof became someone trying to get in. Claire wanted to pack up and go back to our apartment, but we'd already given notice, already moved everything. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that definitely wasn't my imagination, the distinct sound of metal on metal coming from the direction of the garage. I grabbed the baseball bat we'd brought for protection and crept to the window, Claire right behind me with her phone ready to call 911. The motion sensor light we'd installed that afternoon was on, illuminating the garage and the path leading to it. At first, I couldn't see anything unusual, just our cars parked where we'd left them. Then movement near the garage's side door caught my eye. A figure in dark clothing hunched over the new padlock we'd installed. Even from 40 feet away, I could see the bolt cutters in their hands. Without thinking, I banged on the window hard, and the person's head snapped up. For a split second, our eyes met across the distance. Male, probably mid-40s, thin face covered in patchy stubble, eyes wide with something between surprise and rage. He dropped the bolt cutters and took off into the woods, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every tree and root in those acres. Claire was already on with 911, but by the time the deputies arrived, he was long gone. All they found were the abandoned bolt cutters and boot prints leading into the forest. Deputy Briggs came back out personally, even though her shift had ended hours earlier. She had us walk through everything again while her partner followed the boot prints with a flashlight until they disappeared into a creek about 200 yards from the house. That's when she told us something that made everything click into place. Frank Garrison had a nephew named Tommy who'd been in and out of prison, drugs, theft, that sort of thing. Frank had refused to leave him anything in the will, specifically stated Tommy should get nothing from the estate. The state had tried to notify Tommy about Frank's death, but couldn't locate him. Briggs pulled up his photo on her phone, and even in that tiny screen, I recognized those eyes immediately. She called for backup and organized a proper search, brought in dogs and everything. They found his camp about a half-mile into the woods, a tarp stretched between trees, more supplies, and disturbingly, dozens of photos of the house taken from different angles, including several of Claire and me from moving day. The search continued through the morning, but Tommy had vanished. The dogs lost his scent at the main road, suggesting he'd gotten into a vehicle. Briggs stationed a deputy at our house for the rest of the day while we tried to process everything. We learned more about Tommy from the case file. He'd lived with Frank on and off for years, helping with maintenance when he was clean, disappearing when he wasn't. Neighbors we hadn't met yet started stopping by, sharing stories about seeing him around the property for years, how Frank had tried to help him but finally gave up after Tommy stole from him one too many times. One elderly woman from down the road mentioned she'd seen Tommy at Frank's funeral, standing way in the back, leaving before anyone could talk to him. He must have come straight to the house afterward, setting up his hidden room while the estate went through probate. In his mind, this was still his home, the place he'd always returned to, inheritance or not. We spent that afternoon installing security cameras, new locks, motion sensors on every corner of the house. The security company guy said we were his third call that week for similar issues. Apparently, rural properties attracted all kinds of problems. Claire's sister drove up from Eugene to stay with us for a few days, and having another person there helped, but the damage was done. Every noise outside made us jump. We'd catch ourselves checking the camera feeds obsessively, zooming in on every shadow. 3 days passed without incident, and we started to think maybe Tommy had moved on. Maybe getting caught had scared him off for good. Then, on Wednesday night, while reviewing the camera footage before bed, I noticed something that made my throat close up. There, at 2:47 a.m., a figure at the very edge of the camera's range, just standing there in the trees, watching the house. The image was grainy, but the build was right, the posture familiar. He stood there for exactly 1 hour, never moving closer, just watching, before melting back into the darkness. I called Briggs immediately, and she pulled the footage from her personal phone, cursing under her breath. They organized another search at dawn, this time bringing in state police. The investigation revealed Tommy had been appearing on multiple cameras throughout the neighborhood, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always maintaining distance, but clearly establishing a pattern of surveillance. A gas station camera caught him buying supplies 2 towns over, paying cash. Hood pulled up, but his face still partially visible. They put out a wider alert, but Tommy knew the area like the back of his hand. Every logging road, every abandoned structure, every place to disappear. What really got to us was the psychological aspect of it. He wasn't trying to break in anymore, wasn't attempting to reclaim the room. He was just watching, waiting. The detective assigned to the case said sometimes people like Tommy created elaborate fantasies about places, especially homes they felt connected to. He might spend months or even years orbiting the property, never quite letting go, never quite moving on. That was 6 weeks ago, and we're still here, though everything's different now. We caught Tommy last week, not the police, but us. Claire spotted him trying to get into the garage again at 3 a.m., and this time we were ready. I hit the floodlights while she called 911, and our neighbor Brian, a veteran who'd been keeping watch with us, blocked the driveway with his truck. Tommy didn't run this time, just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking defeated and somehow smaller than I remembered. When the police arrived, he went quietly, and Briggs told us later he'd been living in an abandoned cabin about 3 miles away. The walls covered with photos of the house from Frank's time. He's in custody now, waiting for trial, and his public defender thinks he'll take a plea deal. We're selling the house. Already have buyers lined up, a young family who doesn't know the whole story and doesn't need to. Claire found us a nice place closer to town, with neighbors on both sides and no hidden rooms. Sometimes I drive by the old property, and it looks peaceful, even beautiful. But I know better now. Some houses hold on to their ghosts, whether they're dead or alive, and sometimes the only solution is to leave them behind. The day I got the keys to my first house in suburban Michigan should have been the happiest moment of my life. I was 32, finally done renting crappy apartments, and ready to plant some roots in a quiet neighborhood where kids still rode bikes in the street. The place wasn't fancy, just a small 2-bedroom ranch with faded blue siding and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left, but it was mine. I remember standing in the empty living room that first afternoon, August sun streaming through the windows, thinking about where I'd put my couch, my TV, all the stuff that had been crammed in storage for weeks. The realtor had mentioned the neighbors were interesting characters, but I figured that was just code for old people who might complain if I mowed my lawn too early on Sundays. I spent that first week moving boxes and trying to make the place feel like home, and I figured it was time to do the neighborly thing and introduce myself. The house on my left belonged to the Andersons, sweet elderly couple who brought me a casserole and talked my ear off about their grandkids for 20 minutes. The house on my right, though, that's where things got weird. It was a yellow split level with overgrown bushes that nearly covered the front windows, and the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in months. When I knocked on the door that Saturday morning, holding a 6-pack of beer as a peace offering, it took forever before someone answered. The guy who finally opened the door was probably mid-40s, wearing a stained white undershirt and jeans that looked like they'd been slept in. His name was Gerald, and the way he stared at me when I introduced myself made my chest tighten. Not aggressive exactly, but intense, like he was memorizing every detail of my face. Gerald barely spoke during our brief interaction, just took the beer with this odd little nod, and asked me 3 times what my work schedule was like. Not in a friendly, let's grab a beer sometime way, but more like he was filing the information away for later. He kept glancing past me toward my house, even leaning out the door frame to get a better look at my driveway, and when I mentioned I worked from home doing graphic design, his eyes lit up in this unsettling way. The whole conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but I left his porch feeling like I needed a shower. I told myself I was being paranoid. The guy was probably just socially awkward, maybe on the spectrum or something, and I had boxes to unpack anyway. But that night, when I was carrying stuff from my car around 9 p.m., I caught him standing at his kitchen window, not even pretending to do anything else, just watching me with the lights off in his house. The weird stuff started small at first, things I could explain away if I tried hard enough. I'd find random objects in my yard that weren't mine. A broken watch near my front steps, an old baseball cap hanging on my fence, a single work glove placed perfectly in the middle of my driveway. I figured maybe the wind blew them over from Gerald's yard, even though there hadn't been any strong winds lately. Then I started noticing him outside whenever I was outside, like clockwork. If I went to check my mail, he'd suddenly need to water his dead plants. If I grilled dinner on my back patio, he'd appear in his backyard within minutes, not doing anything, just standing there by his shed, pretending to organize tools while stealing glances in my direction. The Andersons must have noticed too, because Mrs. Anderson pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was all right, with a concerned look that told me she knew more than she was saying. About 3 weeks after I'd moved in, things took a darker turn. I woke up around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday to find Gerald in my backyard with a flashlight, crouched near my bedroom window. When I flicked on my porch light and opened the back door to confront him, he didn't run or act embarrassed like a normal person caught doing something wrong. He just stood up slowly, turned the flashlight off, and said he thought he saw a raccoon go under my deck and wanted to make sure it wasn't rabid. The explanation was so obviously bullshit. His voice was too calm, too rehearsed. And why would he care about raccoons under my deck at 2 in the morning? I told him firmly to stay off my property, and he just smiled this empty smile and walked back to his house without another word. I installed motion sensor lights the next day and started double-checking my locks before bed, but I could still feel him watching, especially at night when I'd catch glimpses of movement in his dark windows. The items he left started getting more personal and disturbing. Instead of random junk, I began finding things that seemed specifically chosen to mess with me. A printed photo of my house from Google Street View, dated from before I moved in, tucked under my windshield wiper. A hardware store receipt for rope, duct tape, and zip ties, deliberately placed where I'd see it on my morning walk to the car. Once I found a dead sparrow arranged on my welcome mat with its wings spread out perfectly symmetrical, like someone had posed it. I called the police after that one, but they said unless Gerald directly threatened me, or I had proof he was leaving this stuff, there wasn't much they could do. The cop who came out, Officer Brennan, Officer Coleman, even seemed annoyed, like I was wasting his time with neighbor drama. He suggested I install cameras, which I did, but Gerald must have figured out the blind spots because the creepy gifs kept coming, always placed just outside the camera's range. The pounding on my door started on a Friday night in September. I was watching TV around 11 p.m. when these heavy, rhythmic thuds shook my front door, not knocking but full palm slams that rattled the frame. By the time I looked through the peephole, nobody was there, but I could hear footsteps running through the grass. It happened again the next night, and the next, always between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., always the same pattern. 3 sets of 5 pounds, then silence. I knew it was Gerald, who else would it be? But I could never catch him in the act. I started sleeping on my couch with a baseball bat next to me and my phone ready to dial 911. The exhaustion was getting to me. I was making mistakes at work, snapping at clients on video calls, living on coffee and energy drinks. My sister in Arizona kept telling me to just move, but I'd sunk everything into this house, and some stubborn part of me refused to let this creep drive me from my own home. Then came that Wednesday night, when everything went to hell. I'd actually managed to fall asleep in my bed for once when I heard glass breaking downstairs around 3 a.m. Not the door pounding this time, actual breaking glass. I grabbed the bat and my phone, creeping down the hallway with my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Gerald was in my kitchen, standing there in dirty sweatpants and no shirt, holding a hammer in one hand and just waiting for me. He'd smashed through my back door's window panel and reached in to unlock it. The kitchen light was on and I could see he'd been crying. His face was streaked with tears and snot, but his expression was completely blank. He started talking in this monotone voice about how I'd ruined everything by moving in, how the previous owner understood the arrangement, how I needed to leave or learn to follow the rules. I asked what rules, trying to keep him talking while I dialed 911 behind my back, and he just kept repeating that I knew what he meant, that I was pretending not to understand, that neighbors were supposed to share everything. When he took a step toward me with that hammer raised, instinct kicked in, and I swung the bat as hard as I could at his arm. The crack it made when it connected was horrible, definitely broke something, and Gerald dropped the hammer, screaming this high-pitched wail that didn't sound human. But instead of backing off, he lunged at me with his good arm, knocking us both into my kitchen table. We went down hard, him on top of me, his face inches from mine, breath reeking of something chemical, maybe paint thinner or cleaning products. He was surprisingly strong for someone who looked so unhealthy, and he managed to get his good hand around my throat, while his broken arm hung useless at his side. I could hear the 911 operator's tiny voice from my phone somewhere on the floor, and I remember thinking absurdly that I should have gotten a landline installed. I managed to knee him hard in the stomach, which loosened his grip enough for me to roll away and scramble for the back door. He tried to follow but slipped on the broken glass, going down face first with this wet, crunching sound that made me gag. The police found him still lying there in my kitchen, conscious but not trying to get up anymore, just moaning and bleeding from dozens of cuts on his face and chest. Turns out Gerald had a history: 2 restraining orders from previous neighbors in different states, an involuntary psychiatric hold from 2017, and a notebook in his house filled with observations about me, down to what time I turned my lights off each night and what I'd eaten for dinner based on my trash. The previous owner of my house, an old man named Douglas, had apparently been feeding Gerald dinner twice a week and letting him use his garage for some weird woodworking projects, thinking he was being charitable to a troubled neighbor. When Douglas died and I moved in, Gerald expected the arrangement to continue, but with his own twisted additions. The prosecutors said he'd been building up to something worse. They found sketches in his notebook of my house layout, including my bedroom, with notes about the best entry points and something about teaching proper respect. He got 4 years, which seems like nothing considering he'll be out eventually and probably still remember where I live. I couldn't stay in that house after that night. Every creak, every shadow, every car driving slowly past would send me into a panic. I'd lie awake replaying the feeling of his hand on my throat, the weight of him on top of me, that chemical smell that seemed to linger in my kitchen no matter how many times I cleaned. I lasted another month staying with friends most nights before I put the place on the market. Took a huge loss selling it that quickly, and I had to disclose the incident to potential buyers, which scared most of them off. The young couple who finally bought it seemed to think they were getting a great deal, and I didn't have the energy to explain that no discount was worth living next to that house. I drove by once about 6 months later, couldn't help myself, and saw they'd already installed a massive fence between the properties, and what looked like 3 more security cameras than I'd ever had. Gerald's house looked exactly the same. Overgrown, yellow paint peeling, those dark windows that still made my skin prickle even from inside my locked car. I rent an apartment now in a building with a doorman and security cameras in every hallway, on the 4th floor where no one can reach my windows. It costs more than my mortgage did, but I sleep better, mostly. Sometimes I Google Gerald's name to see if he's been released early, and I've got alerts set up for any news involving him. My therapist says I'm making progress with the PTSD, but I still can't handle having neighbors get too friendly. When the guy across the hall tried to invite me to a building barbecue last month, I made up an excuse and didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. The funny thing is, I still own that baseball bat. Keep it next to my bed even though I'm 40 feet off the ground with a deadbolt and a chain on my door. I know it doesn't make logical sense, but neither did Gerald. And at least the bat's weight in my hands reminds me that I survived, that I fought back, that I'm not in that house anymore, even if part of me never really left that kitchen. I never thought buying my first house would turn into the nightmare that consumed my life last November. I was 28, had just gotten promoted to senior accountant at a tech startup in Ohio, and finally had enough saved for a down payment. The market was brutal, everything way over my budget until my realtor, Kevin, called about a foreclosure in Westfield, a quiet suburb about 40 minutes from downtown. The previous owner, a woman named Diane Hutcherson, had apparently stopped paying her mortgage after her husband died, and the bank had seized the property 6 months earlier. The house sat empty since then, priced at nearly half the market value because it needed some cosmetic work. I remember walking through it that first time, seeing past the peeling wallpaper and outdated kitchen, imagining how I'd transform each room. The bones were solid, a 1960s ranch with hardwood floors, 3 bedrooms, and a huge backyard bordered by thick hedges that gave it privacy from the neighbors. The first 3 weeks after I moved in were perfect. I spent every evening after work painting walls, pulling up old carpet, discovering beautiful original hardwood underneath. My coworker Nathan helped me install new light fixtures one weekend, and my sister drove up from Cincinnati to help me tackle the garden, which had grown wild with morning glories tangling through rusted tomato cages. I'd fall asleep exhausted but satisfied, listening to the house settle around me, learning its particular creaks and sighs. The neighbors were friendly enough. The Washingtons next door brought cookies, told me how glad they were someone was finally fixing the place up. They mentioned Diane only briefly, how she'd kept to herself after her husband passed, how the foreclosure had been ugly, sheriff's deputies having to physically remove her while she screamed that they couldn't take her home. But that was months ago, they assured me, ancient history. I was too busy stripping wallpaper and choosing paint colors to think much about the woman who'd lived here before, though I did find odd things she'd left behind. A shoebox full of expired coupons in the basement, a wedding dress hanging in the back of the master closet that I donated to Goodwill. It started on a Thursday night in early December. I'd just gotten home from work around 7, was heating up leftover Chinese food when I heard someone outside. Not walking past, but standing at the end of my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could make out a figure in the darkness. A woman in what looked like a long raincoat even though it wasn't raining. She just stood there, facing the house. I watched for maybe 5 minutes, my Lomin getting cold, before she finally turned and walked away. I figured she was probably just someone out for an evening walk who'd stopped to tie her shoe or check her phone. But the next night, she was back. Same spot, same long coat, this time for almost 20 minutes. The streetlight caught her face briefly when a car passed. Middle-aged, hollow cheeks, stringy gray blonde hair that hadn't seen a brush in weeks. That's when the Washington story about Diane crept back into my mind. I pulled up her name on social media, found an old profile with photos from happier times. The woman in those pictures was heavier, well-groomed, smiling next to a bearded man at various backyard barbecues. But the bone structure was the same. Saturday night changed everything. I was watching Netflix in the living room when I heard it, not knocking but pounding on the front door, the kind that rattles the frame. Then her voice, raw and desperate. "This is my house. You can't just take someone's house. I lived here for 18 years. I crept to the window, peeked through the blinds. Diane was on my porch, both fists hammering the door, her coat hanging open over what looked like pajamas and rubber boots. Her face was twisted with rage, spit flying as she yelled, "I know you're in there! Get out of my house! Robert built that deck for me, planted those roses for me." I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling as I called 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line while Diane continued her assault on my door, switching between threats and sobs. "I'll make you leave, you'll see. This is theft. Grand theft. My husband died in this house." By the time the police arrived 12 minutes later, the longest 12 minutes of my life, she'd moved to kicking the door, leaving black boot marks on the white paint I'd just applied the week before. The officers knew her by name. "Come on, Diane, we've talked about this," the younger one said, surprisingly gentle as they led her to the patrol car. She went quiet then, just stared at me through the back window with this expression I'll never forget. Not angry anymore, but calculating, like she was memorizing every detail of my face. The older officer took my statement, explained that Diane had been living with her sister across town since the foreclosure, but kept showing up at the house. "She has some mental health issues," he said, which seemed like an understatement. "Lost her job at the post office after her husband passed, stopped taking her medication. The sister's trying to get her help." He suggested I file for a restraining order first thing Monday morning, gave me a case number. After they left, I deadbolted the door, checked every window lock twice, but sleep didn't come easy. Around 3 in the morning, I heard glass breaking in the backyard. By the time I worked up the courage to look, there was just my garden gnome shattered across the patio, and no sign of who'd done it. Monday morning, I took time off work to file the restraining order at the courthouse downtown. The clerk said it would take a few days to process and serve her. Those few days were hell. Diane appeared every night like clockwork, but now she stayed just outside what she must have thought was my property line. She'd stand by the mailbox at the street, holding a camping lantern up high, swaying it back and forth like some demented lighthouse keeper. Sometimes she'd sing, old hymns mostly, but with the words changed. Instead of "This little light of mine," she'd sing, "This little house of mine," over and over until I wanted to scream. I started sleeping in the back bedroom, installed motion detector lights that turned the yard into a stadium whenever a cat walked through. The Washingtons told me they'd called the police twice themselves, but since she was technically on public property, there wasn't much anyone could do until the restraining order went through. Thursday morning, I found every single one of my new roses pulled up by the roots, arranged in a circle on the front lawn with their heads pointing toward the house like some kind of sick compass. Friday night was when she truly lost it. I woke up around midnight to the sound of scratching. Not at the door, but above me. She was on the roof. I could hear her shuffling around up there, muttering to herself, occasionally letting out these broken laughs. I called 911 again, barricaded myself in the bathroom with a baseball bat I'd bought that week, and waited. Through the bathroom vent, I could hear her more clearly. "Robert always said we should have fixed these shingles. 22 years old, these shingles. I told him we needed new ones before the rain came." Then the scratching turned to pounding, like she was trying to punch through. The police found her attempting to pry open the attic vent with a crowbar she'd brought in a floral tote bag, along with a hammer and a box of her dead husband's ashes. They arrested her this time. Criminal trespass, attempted breaking and entering, violation of the restraining order that had finally been served that morning. As they dragged her off the roof, she kept screaming that she just wanted to spread Robert's ashes in the attic where he'd built her a craft room, that I had no right to keep her from saying goodbye properly. The next morning, her sister Eleanor showed up at my door, an exhausted-looking woman in her 60s wearing nurse scrubs, holding a plastic container of cookies like the world's saddest peace offering. She stood on my porch crying, apologizing over and over, explaining that Diane had been sneaking out at night, that they'd tried everything, medication, therapy, even hiring someone to watch her. But she kept escaping. "She thinks if she can just get back in the house, Robert will be there," Eleanor said, crushing the cookie container against her chest. "She can't accept he's gone, can't accept the house is gone, everything's gone." She told me they were moving Diane to a facility in Indiana, somewhere with better security. and specialized treatment for her particular brand of grief-induced psychosis. I wanted to be angry, wanted to scream about my destroyed roses and sleepless nights, and the fact that I developed a nervous twitch every time I heard a noise outside. But looking at Eleanor's face, I just felt hollow. She handed me an envelope before leaving. Inside was a check for $2,000 and a note in shaky handwriting. "For the roses and your trouble. I'm sorry she scared you." The house was all she had left of him. For a week after that, I jumped at shadows. Every creak in the house made me grab my phone, ready to call 911. I installed security cameras, bought blackout curtains so no one could see inside, even adopted a German shepherd from the shelter, a massive beast named Brutus who barked at leaves but made me feel less alone. The neighbors checked on me constantly, bringing casseroles and offering to stay over, but I kept insisting I was fine. I wasn't fine. I'd catch myself staring at the attic vent she'd tried to break through, imagining her up there with those ashes, talking to a ghost. I couldn't use the master bedroom anymore. Knowing that's where Robert had died made the walls feel like they were pressing in. I started sleeping on the couch with Brutus at my feet and all the lights on. My sister kept saying I should sell the place, move back closer to Cincinnati, but I was stubborn. This was my house now, bought fair and square, and I'd be damned if I let a grieving woman's breakdown drive me from my first real home. Then 3 weeks before Christmas, my phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was Eleanor, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Diane had escaped from the facility in Indiana, stole a car from the parking lot, and nobody knew where she was. The police were looking, Eleanor assured me, but somehow I already knew where Diane would go. I got dressed, grabbed Brutus's leash, and sure enough, there she was in my backyard, kneeling by the spot where the roses had been. She dug a hole with her bare hands, dirt caked under her fingernails and streaked across her face. In her lap was the box of ashes, the lid open, some of the contents already scattered in the hole. She looked up when Brutus barked, and I swear she didn't even recognize me. Her eyes were completely vacant, looking through me at something that wasn't there. "Robert wants different roses," she said calmly, like we were having a normal conversation about gardening. "Yellow ones this time. He says the red ones made the house look angry." She went back to digging, humming that horrific version of "This Little Light of Mine" again, occasionally sprinkling more ashes into the earth. I didn't call the police right away. Something about the way she knelt there, covered in dirt and talking to her dead husband, made me pause. Instead, I sat down on the patio steps, keeping Brutus close, and watched her work. She planted invisible seeds in the holes she'd made, patting the ash-mixed soil gently, whispering promises about how beautiful the garden would be come spring. "Remember when Timothy was 5 and he helped us plant the tomatoes?" she asked the air beside her. "He ate more than he planted. You laughed so hard you got hiccups." That's when I realized there had been a child in this house once. Timothy, who must be grown now, probably estranged given that neither Eleanor nor Diane had mentioned him. I found myself wondering what had happened to this family, how they'd gone from planting tomatoes with a 5-year-old to this scene in my backyard. When the police finally arrived, Eleanor had called them after calling me. Diane didn't resist. She just asked if she could finish planting one more rose, holding up an empty hand toward the officer. They let her make the motion of placing something in the soil, let her pat it down one final time. As they walked her to the car, she turned back and said, "Water them every Thursday." Robert always watered on Thursdays. I never saw Diane again after that night. Eleanor told me they moved her to a more secure facility in Illinois, somewhere that specialized in severe dissociative disorders. I paid to have new roses planted, yellow ones like she'd wanted, and I do water them on Thursdays, though I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's respect for the life that was lived here before mine. The house feels different now, less like something I conquered and more like something I'm borrowing. I found Timothy on social media eventually. He's 32, lives in Seattle, hasn't spoken to his mother in 8 years since she accused him of stealing his father's tools when he was just trying to help clean out the garage. He didn't want to hear about the roses or the ashes or how his mother had tried to claw her way back into her old life through my attic vent. Some nights, when Brutus barks at nothing in particular, I wonder if it's really nothing or if houses remember their histories, if somewhere in these walls Robert and Diane's better days are still playing out. Sunday dinners and birthday parties and a little boy eating tomatoes straight from the garden. I kept the house despite everything. Sold it would feel like stealing it twice. The yellow roses are thriving, growing wild and untamed no matter how much I try to prune them, like they're determined to reclaim the space in their own way. Sometimes I think that's exactly what Diane knew would happen, that maybe in her broken mind, she found a way to stay after all. I teach history at the community college just outside of town, and my wife Amanda runs her own accounting business from home. We'd been renting for 6 years when we finally scraped together enough for a down payment on this old colonial from the 70s. April of 2022, that's when everything started. The housing market was insane, and we jumped on the first decent place we could actually afford. 2 stories, faded yellow siding, and a kitchen that desperately needed updating. But it had good bones and a huge basement for storage. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Carters, had lived there for almost 20 years before moving to Florida. They seemed eager to sell, even knocked $5,000 off the asking price without us negotiating. At the time, we thought we were just lucky. I discovered the crawl space 3 weeks later while organizing the area under the stairs. Behind a pile of old paint cans and drop cloths, there was this small door, maybe 3 feet high, 2 feet wide. What made me stop dead in my tracks was how it was sealed. Someone had absolutely destroyed it with nails, at least 30 of them, hammered in at crazy angles like they were trying to keep something inside. The wood frame was splintered, with deep gouges around the edges where it looked like someone had tried prying it open before giving up. Some nails were bent completely sideways, others driven so deep the heads had disappeared into the wood. Amanda came down when she heard me swearing at the mess, and we both just stared at this door that looked like it had been sealed in a panic. Neither the inspector nor the realtor had mentioned anything about a sealed storage space, and trust me, I'd read every page of that inspection report twice. We spent the next hour debating whether to open it. Amanda thought we should call the realtor first, maybe even a contractor, but curiosity was eating at me. I mean, who nails a crawl space shut like that? I grabbed my toolbox from the garage and started working on those nails with a crowbar and hammer. Each one came out with this awful screech, and the smell that started leaking out was musty, like wet newspapers mixed with something else I couldn't place. Took me 45 minutes to get them all out, my shirt soaked through with sweat by the end. When I finally yanked the door open, we both had to step back. The smell hit us full force, not rotten exactly, but stale and wrong. Like opening a time capsule that should have stayed buried. Amanda held her phone's flashlight while I crouched down to look inside. The space was bigger than expected, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, with a dirt floor, but it wasn't empty. There were stacks of mail rubber banded together, all yellowed and warped from moisture. Kids' clothes were piled in one corner, little dresses with faded flower patterns, tiny sneakers that looked like they were from the 80s, a baseball mitt so small it would barely fit my hand. The weirdest part was the photos, dozens of them scattered across the dirt like someone had thrown them in there in a hurry. I reached in and grabbed a handful, and that's when things got genuinely uncomfortable. They weren't family photos like you'd expect. Every single one showed different people in various rooms of our house. Our kitchen, our living room, the master bedroom. Different families, different time periods based on the clothes and hairstyles, but all taken from the same angles, like someone had specific spots they liked to shoot from. Amanda picked up one of the mail bundles and carefully pulled off the rubber band, which crumbled immediately. The envelopes were addressed to at least 4 different families: the Richardsons, the Nguyens, the Washingtons, and someone named Harold Brennan. All of them had lived at our address at different times. But here's what made my skin prickle. Every single envelope had been opened, then carefully resealed with tape. Some had notes written in pencil on the backs, things like daughter home at 3:15, husband leaves at 7:30 sharp, grocery shopping Saturdays. Amanda found a notebook wrapped in plastic, and when she opened it, her face went pale. Someone had been keeping detailed logs about the families who lived here, pages and pages of observations, when they showered, what TV shows they watched, when they had arguments, even when they were intimate. The handwriting was neat, obsessively so, with dates going back to 1987. I wanted to throw everything back in and nail that door shut again, but Amanda insisted we needed to document this before calling the police. We spent the next hour pulling everything out, taking photos with our phones, trying to make sense of it all. There was a manila folder at the very back, and inside were floor plans of our house. Not official blueprints, but hand-drawn sketches showing every room, every closet, even measurements of the crawl spaces in the attic. Someone had marked specific spots with red X's, one in the corner of the master bedroom ceiling, another behind the water heater in the basement, one in the kitchen pantry. Next to each X was a note: good visibility, audio clear, check monthly. My mouth went completely dry when I realized what we were looking at. We practically ran to the bedroom, and sure enough, in the corner where the ceiling met the walls, there was a tiny hole, painted over but still visible if you knew where to look. We checked every spot marked on those sketches. Behind the water heater, there was another hole drilled through the drywall, positioned perfectly to see into the downstairs bathroom. The pantry had one too, aimed at the kitchen table where we ate every meal. Each hole was maybe the width of a pencil, easy to miss if you weren't specifically searching for them, and all of them had been painted over multiple times through the years. Amanda was on the phone with the police while I kept searching, and that's when I found something that made everything infinitely worse. In the attic, tucked behind the insulation, was a metal box with a padlock that had been cut. Inside were more recent photos, digital prints this time. The Carters, the elderly couple we'd bought the house from, going about their daily routines, completely unaware they were being photographed. The last photo was dated just 2 months before they sold us the house. The police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else until I showed them what we'd found. They called for backup, and soon our house was crawling with investigators. A detective named Morrison took our statements while a forensics team photographed everything. He told us they'd been looking for something like this for years. Apparently, there had been reports from former residents of this house going back decades. Mail going missing, items moved while people were at work, pets acting agitated at specific spots in the house. But nobody had ever found concrete evidence until now. The detective asked if we'd noticed anything unusual since moving in, and that's when Amanda remembered something. 3 days after we'd moved in, we'd gotten a welcome card in our mailbox. Nothing unusual about that, except it mentioned how nice our new bedroom curtains looked. Curtains we'd hung just the night before, in our second-floor bedroom, facing the backyard where nobody should have been able to see them. That night, we stayed at a hotel while the police processed our house. But the next morning when we went to check out, the desk clerk handed me an envelope that someone had dropped off for us. No name, no return address, just our names written in that same obsessively neat handwriting from the notebook. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed words. You shouldn't have opened that door. The Carters understood the arrangement. You sleep so peacefully at 11:47 p.m., right side, Amanda on the left. The blue coffee mug is your favorite. You missed a spot shaving yesterday, just below your left ear. My legs nearly gave out. Whoever this was had been watching us for 3 weeks, knew our routines, our habits, which side of the bed we slept on. The detective took the letter as evidence, but what could they really do? The holes in the walls proved someone had been watching, but they had no idea who. We went back to the house with a security company that afternoon. They swept everything, found 2 more holes we'd missed, one in the garage ceiling and another in the guest bathroom vent. While they were installing cameras and new locks, I decided to talk to the neighbors. Mrs. Vasquez, who'd lived next door for 15 years, went quiet when I mentioned what we'd found. She told me about a man named Eugene Caldwell who used to own our house in the 80s, before it was sold to the first of the families we'd found photos of. He'd been a photographer, she said, always carrying around these old cameras, taking pictures of birds and landscapes. But after his wife left him and took their daughter, he'd become reclusive, strange. The house was foreclosed on in 1986 and he disappeared. Nobody knew where he went. But every family who'd lived in that house since had eventually moved out, usually within 2 years, always seeming rattled but never saying exactly why. The letters kept coming for 2 more weeks, each one more detailed than the last. They'd arrive at different locations. My office at the college, Amanda's business mailbox, even my mom's house in Massachusetts when we went to visit her for a weekend. Whoever Eugene Caldwell was, or if it was even him, he seemed to know our every move before we made it. The police put a trace on our phones, thinking maybe they were hacked, but found nothing. They even stationed an unmarked car outside our house for a few nights. But the letters still came. One particularly disturbing note described the nightmare I'd had 3 nights prior, down to the detail about falling off a bridge made of teeth, something I'd only mentioned to Amanda the next morning while we were in our bedroom with all the windows closed and the new white noise machine running. The breaking point came on a Monday morning in May. I'd taken a sick day to meet with another security consultant, and Amanda had gone to work early for a parent-teacher conference. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking from room to room. I grabbed a baseball bat and called 911, then crept up the stairs. The master bedroom door was open, and there was a manila envelope on our bed with "Final Notice" written across it. Inside were photos taken over the past month, us sleeping, eating dinner, Amanda in the shower, photographed from outside through a gap we hadn't noticed in the bathroom blinds, me grading papers at my desk. But the last item made my decision for us. A photo of Amanda at her school, taken from inside an empty classroom, showing her walking down the hallway alone. We packed everything we could fit in our cars that afternoon and never went back. The house is still on the market 8 months later. The realtor says potential buyers always get a feeling about the place. We're renting again now, across the state. And every night I check the windows, the vents, the corners where walls meet ceilings. The police never found Eugene Caldwell or whoever was watching us, but sometimes I wonder if they ever really stopped. My wife Ashley and I had been searching for the perfect starter home for almost 2 years when we finally found it in early August 2023. The place was a modest 2-story colonial in Oakdale, Pennsylvania. Nothing fancy, but exactly what we needed. It had been sitting on the market for 7 months, which should have been our first red flag. But the inspector said everything checked out fine. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Martins, had already moved to a retirement community in California, and their son Bradley was handling the sale remotely. He seemed eager to close quickly, even knocked $5,000 off the asking price without us negotiating. Ashley kept saying we were lucky, that the housing market was finally cooling down and we'd gotten a steal. I remember feeling proud as I carried boxes through that front door, thinking about all the memories we'd make there. The first 2 weeks were perfect. Exactly what you'd expect when settling into a new place. We painted the living room a warm gray, fixed a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, and met some of the neighbors at the annual block barbecue. Everyone seemed surprised the house had finally sold, mentioning how they'd seen so many people tour it over the months, but nobody ever made an offer. Mrs. Crawford from next door, a sweet woman in her 70s who brought us homemade banana bread, mentioned something odd about seeing lights on in the house occasionally, even when it was supposed to be empty. But she laughed it off, saying her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. Ashley and I were too busy unpacking and arranging furniture to give it much thought. We were home, that's all that mattered. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 17 days after we'd moved in, when the first knock came. I was in the kitchen making coffee, still in my pajama pants and an old college t-shirt, when someone started pounding on the front door. Not knocking politely, but really hammering away like there was an emergency. Ashley was in the shower upstairs, so I rushed to answer it, thinking maybe something had happened to one of the neighbors. Standing on my porch was a man I'd never seen before, probably mid-40s, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and khakis. He had this eager expression, like a kid on Christmas morning, and he was holding his phone up showing what looked like a real estate listing. Before I could even say hello, he started talking fast, saying he was there for the open house, that the listing said Saturday morning at 9. I told him there must be some mistake, that we'd bought the house 3 weeks ago. His face went through this weird transformation, from excitement to confusion to something that almost looked like anger. The man, who never gave his name, kept insisting I was wrong. He showed me his phone screen, and sure enough, there was our house listed for sale on some website I'd never heard of called quickhomedeals.com. The photos were recent too, taken from angles that showed our car in the driveway and our new doormat that said The Johnsons in cursive letters. The listing price was laughably low, about 60% of what we'd paid, and it promised immediate occupancy and cash-only deals preferred. My chest got tight as I scrolled through the description, which had details about the house that only someone who'd been inside recently would know, like the newly installed water heater, and the fact that the basement door stuck if you didn't lift it slightly when closing. The man got impatient and tried to peer around me into the house, asking if the sellers were home, if maybe I was just a house sitter or something. I had to physically block the doorway and tell him firmly that he needed to leave, that someone was playing a cruel prank. After he finally left, muttering about wasting his morning and how unprofessional this was, I immediately went to the website he'd shown me. The listing was still there, and I found 3 others on different sites: Home Quick Sale, Cash House Buyers, and something called Now Realty. Each listing had slightly different photos, all taken recently, some showing angles that would require being in our backyard or even pressed against our windows. One photo showed our bedroom window from outside, and you could see Ashley's jewelry box on the dresser inside. Another showed our back door, which we'd painted blue just the week before. I called Ashley down and showed her everything. She went pale and started checking all the locks while I tried calling the websites to get the listings removed. Most of them just had contact forms, no phone numbers, and the ones that did have numbers led to automated systems that hung up after putting me on hold for 20 minutes. We spent the rest of that Saturday paranoid, peeking through curtains every time a car slowed down near our house. The next morning, Sunday, it got worse. I woke up around 6 to let our dog Murphy out and found a family of 4 standing in our front yard, the parents taking photos while 2 teenage kids sat on our porch steps looking bored. The father was measuring the width of the driveway with one of those roller measuring tools, and the mother was on her phone, apparently doing calculations. When I opened the door, still half asleep and confused, they all turned to look at me with these bright, expectant smiles. The father immediately launched into questions about school districts and whether the basement had ever flooded, while the mother asked if we'd accept an offer today if it was all cash. The teenagers had already gotten up and were trying to look through our front window, hands cupped around their faces to see through the glare. I had to raise my voice, something I rarely do, to get them to understand that the house wasn't for sale, that they'd been scammed by fake listings. The father got defensive, pulled out his phone to show me emails from someone claiming to be the owner, complete with an official-looking contract template and everything. The emails were from someone calling themselves Bradley Martin, the actual name of the previous owner's son who'd handled our sale. But the email address was slightly different from the real one, using Bradley Martin 442 at Gmail instead of his actual business email. This person had been corresponding with multiple interested buyers for weeks, sending them detailed information about the house, scheduling viewings, and even providing a lockbox code that supposedly would give them access. The family I was dealing with had driven 3 hours from Harrisburg based on these emails, and they'd already put down a good faith deposit of $2,000 into some random Venmo account. When I explained they'd been scammed, The mother started crying while the father got angry at me, as if I was somehow in on it. They wouldn't leave until I showed them our closing documents, and even then, the father took photos of our house number and said his lawyer would be in touch. Ashley watched the whole thing from the doorway, clutching Murphy's collar to keep him from running out, and I could see her getting more upset by the minute. Monday was supposed to be my first day back at work after taking time off for the move, but I called in sick because we had 7 different groups show up between sunrise and noon. 7. One guy came at 5:45 a.m. with a U-Haul, ready to move in immediately because the seller had told him the house was vacant and he could start bringing boxes early. A young couple showed up with their real estate agent, who got aggressive when I wouldn't let them in for their scheduled tour and threatened to report me for interfering with a sale. An older woman arrived with her adult son and had a panic attack on our lawn when she realized she'd been scammed out of a $5,000 deposit. The police came twice because neighbors called about all the commotion, but they said unless someone actually tried to break in, it was a civil matter. Officer Russo, who responded the second time, suggested we put up a sign saying the house wasn't for sale, as if a piece of cardboard would stop people who'd already driven hours and spent thousands of dollars based on elaborate fake listings. Wednesday night changed everything. Ashley and I had barely slept since Saturday, taking shifts staying awake to watch for strangers. Around 2 a.m., Murphy started growling, that low rumble he only makes when something's really wrong. I crept to the window and saw a van parked across the street with its engine running, no lights on. 2 men were standing at our front door, and I could hear metal scraping against metal. They were trying to pick the lock. My whole body went cold as I watched one of them pull out what looked like a crowbar. Ashley was already calling 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher, while I grabbed the baseball bat we kept in the closet. The sound of wood splintering made my heart pound so hard I thought I might pass out. They were actually breaking in, not just knocking or taking pictures, but forcing their way into our home. I screamed at them through the door that the police were coming, that I was armed, anything to make them stop. One of them yelled back that they'd paid $8,000 for this house, that they had every right to be there, that we were the ones trespassing. The police arrived within 4 minutes, but it felt like hours. The men tried to run, but only made it to their van before the officers blocked them in. Turns out they had a truck following behind, ready to load up whatever was in the house. Our belongings. They genuinely believed they'd purchased the property in a private cash sale and were there to claim what was theirs. Their proof was extensive: fake deed transfers, a bogus title company website that looked completely legitimate, even a counterfeit cashier's check receipt. The scammer had been communicating with them for over a month, sending them photos of the interior that must have been taken when the house was actually for sale, mixed with recent exterior shots. They'd sent the money to various Cash App and Zelle accounts, been given closing documents with forged signatures, and were told they could take possession in the middle of the night to avoid difficult tenants who were being evicted. The level of detail in this scam was insane. The fake seller even knew about a repair that needed to be done to the garage door, something only someone familiar with the property would know. After the attempted break-in, the detective assigned to our case, Detective Milner, discovered something that made everything click into place. The IP addresses from the fake listings traced back to various coffee shops and libraries within a 10-mile radius of our house. Someone local was doing this, someone who had access to the property or at least intimate knowledge of it. Ashley remembered that when we'd done our final walkthrough, there was a moment when Bradley Martin had to step out to take a long phone call, leaving us alone with just the real estate agents for about 40 minutes. During that time, his laptop was open on the kitchen counter, logged into his email and various real estate platforms. The detective also found that the lockbox on the property had never been properly deactivated. It was still hanging on the back gate, hidden behind some overgrown ivy. Anyone who knew the code could have been accessing the backyard to take those recent photos. When they pulled the access logs from the digital lockbox, it showed entries at weird hours over the past 3 weeks, always when we weren't home, times that matched when both our cars were gone. The police arrested Bradley Martin 5 days later at his apartment in Newark. He'd been running the same scam on 4 other properties he'd helped sell over the past year, collecting deposits and fees from desperate buyers in a hot housing market. He knew these houses inside and out, had all the documentation to make believable forgeries, and specifically targeted out-of-state buyers who wouldn't easily be able to verify things in person. In our case, he'd gotten greedy and started escalating when the house actually sold, figuring he could squeeze out a few more fake sales before anyone caught on. They found over $300,000 spread across various digital payment accounts. Ashley and I had to testify at his trial 6 months later, sitting in that courtroom and seeing all the other victims. Elderly people who'd lost their savings, young families who thought they'd found their dream home, investors who'd been promised impossible deals. He got 12 years. We still live in the house, though we installed a comprehensive security system and changed every single lock twice. Sometimes when there's a knock at the door, especially early in the morning or late at night, my heart still races. But we're staying. This is our home, and no one's going to force us out of it. My name is Rachel, and a few years ago I signed a lease with my friend Hannah on a big old house just outside town. We were both in our mid-20s, working regular jobs and trying to get out of cramped apartments. The place seemed like a dream when we first walked through it. Lots of space, high ceilings, and the kind of wooden floors that creaked in a way that felt cozy rather than unsettling. The rent was surprisingly low for the size, and even though the house had some unfinished areas, like a section of the attic, we shrugged it off as part of the deal. At that point, all I could think about was how exciting it felt to finally have space to breathe. The first weeks were filled with the kind of small joys that come with a new home. Decorating the living room with mismatched thrift store furniture, cooking late dinners together, and even having friends over just to marvel at how much bigger the place was compared to our last apartments. Hannah loved to bake, so the kitchen always smelled like cinnamon or chocolate. I remember sitting at the dining table thinking this might be the start of the most stable period of my life. The creaky floors and occasional draft didn't bother us at all. They felt like harmless quirks of a house that had seen a lot of years go by. But then we started to notice tiny things that didn't make sense. At first it was just food disappearing from the fridge, half a carton of milk gone or leftovers that one of us swore we hadn't touched. Hannah teased me about eating in my sleep, and I joked that maybe she was sneaking midnight snacks. Neither of us wanted to admit it might be something else, so we laughed it off, chalking it up to forgetfulness. Still, the pattern grew clearer over time. One evening I opened the fridge to grab a slice of pie Hannah had made, and the entire dish was gone. She looked at me with genuine confusion when I asked about it. That was the first time I felt a flicker of unease. The unease turned into something heavier a couple of nights later. We were both in the living room watching TV when I muted the sound during a commercial. From above us, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Not the usual settling noises of an old house. The rhythm was too precise. We stared at each other, both waiting for the other to say something first. Hannah whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. The attic wasn't supposed to be accessible beyond a small hatch in the hallway ceiling. We told ourselves it had to be raccoons, or maybe even the wind, but neither of us believed it. That night I barely slept, straining to catch every sound from upstairs. The following morning, Hannah insisted we go up and check the attic together. She grabbed a flashlight and I found the stepladder we'd been using to hang curtains. When we pushed open the hatch, a rush of warm, dusty air hit us. The beam from the flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing insulation, wooden beams, and piles of boxes left by previous tenants. At first, nothing seemed out of place. We crawled carefully over the joists, trying not to fall through the plaster ceiling below. Just as I was ready to declare it empty, Hannah froze the light on something at the far corner, a crumpled blanket and an empty water bottle. The blanket looked recently used, not something forgotten years ago. My heart sank as the reality clicked in. We weren't alone in that house. We climbed down as quickly as we could, barely speaking, both of us pale. The discovery turned our easy jokes into something darker. Someone had been living above us, watching the same roof we thought was ours. That day we locked every window, double-checked every door, and tried to convince ourselves the person had moved on. But the fridge kept telling another story. By the end of the week, more food had gone missing. A pack of yogurt vanished overnight, and I noticed small crumbs on the counter that neither of us remembered leaving. It felt like our own home was betraying us, letting someone slip in and out while we went about our lives. One evening I came home earlier than usual. Hannah was still at work and the house was quiet. As I set my keys down on the counter, I heard the faint creak of a floorboard overhead. My chest tightened, every muscle on edge. I didn't move, afraid of startling whoever was there. After a long silence, I climbed the stairs slowly, pretending I was just going to my room. From the top step, I caught the sound of a soft thud from the attic area. Whoever was up there had realized I'd come home early. I wanted to scream, but instead I backed down quietly, grabbed my phone and called Hannah, whispering for her to get home as soon as possible. That night we argued about what to do. Hannah thought maybe it was a squatter who didn't mean us harm, someone desperate for a place to stay. I couldn't accept that. The idea of a stranger slipping into the kitchen while we slept made me feel sick. We called the landlord, who brushed it off, saying the attic wasn't part of the lease and we should just keep the hatch locked. His indifference made us feel even smaller, like we were stuck dealing with this alone. Hannah suggested setting up a camera, but neither of us owned one, and money was tight. In the end, we just sat in the living room with the lights on, trying to stay awake, the sound of every creak in the ceiling pushing us further into dread. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I woke up around 3 a.m. and heard faint scraping noises above my bedroom ceiling. Not the occasional creak or groan of wood. This sounded like someone shifting objects. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to Hannah's room. She was awake too, eyes wide, already whispering that she'd heard it for the past hour. We stood in the hallway staring at the attic hatch. Then, without warning, it creaked open just a fraction of an inch, as if someone on the other side was checking if the coast was clear. I've never felt so exposed in my life, standing there in my own house while someone else tested how far they could push their secret. We bolted downstairs and locked ourselves in the kitchen, whispering furiously about whether to call the police. Hannah's hands trembled as she dialed, explaining in a hushed tone what was happening. The dispatcher told us to stay put until officers arrived. Those 20 minutes stretched like hours. Every sound of the house settling made me jump. At one point, I swore I heard soft footsteps on the stairs, moving toward where we hid. I pressed my ear against the door, holding my breath, praying the lock would hold. Then, blessedly, red and blue lights flickered through the window, and heavy knocks thundered at the front door. The police swept through the house with flashlights, their voices echoing as they called out. Eventually, one of them shouted for us to come upstairs. We climbed shakily, guided to the attic where they'd found a makeshift sleeping area we hadn't seen before. Blankets, canned food, even a small camping lantern. More disturbing was the narrow gap in the insulation leading to a section we thought was sealed off. From there, the intruder had been slipping down into the house whenever we were gone, or worse, when we were asleep. The officers never caught him that night, but they were certain he'd been there just hours earlier. The half-eaten sandwich sitting on a plate confirmed it. After that, we couldn't stay another night in that house. Hannah and I packed everything we could fit into our cars and crashed at a friend's place until we found another rental. The landlord was furious we broke the lease, but we didn't care. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night convinced I've heard footsteps above me. Moving into a new apartment didn't erase the memory of that attic hatch slowly creaking open. I still wonder how long he had been living there before we noticed, and how many times he might have stood just a few feet away while we slept. When we first moved into the house, everything felt like a fresh start. My wife and I had saved for years to get out of our cramped rental, and even though the place we bought needed work, we were excited. The kitchen was half gutted, the bathrooms outdated, and the living room still smelled faintly of dust and plaster. We decided to hire a handyman to help us finish the big stuff, since I worked long hours and didn't have the skills for major renovations. That's how we met a guy named Mark. He came recommended by a neighbor who said he was handy with just about everything and lived not too far from us. At first, he really did seem like a lifesaver. Mark was chatty, easygoing, and didn't seem to mind the mess. He'd show up in worn jeans and boots splattered with old paint, carrying a beat-up red toolbox that looked older than him. He'd crack little jokes as he worked, and even brought over an old radio to play music while fixing the cabinets. It felt good having someone who seemed trustworthy helping us settle into our first real home. I remember thinking we lucked out finding him so quickly, especially since contractors in the area usually charged way more than we could afford. The first time I felt uneasy was small, almost easy to dismiss. Mark had finished his work for the day and left, but an hour later I noticed his truck parked down the street. At first I figured he just lived nearby or maybe stopped to talk with someone. But when I took out the trash, I saw him sitting in the driver's seat smoking with the engine off. He waved when he noticed me, smiled like it was no big deal, and said he was just making a call. I didn't think much of it then, but it stuck with me that night when I kept catching myself glancing toward the front window. Over the next couple of weeks, the little things began piling up. Mark would show up earlier than we expected, sometimes standing on the porch before either of us was dressed for the day. He'd say he just happened to be in the neighborhood and thought he'd get a head start. Once, he mentioned how nice the curtains looked in our bedroom, curtains he never had a reason to see. Another time, he asked if we always left the back door unlocked, something he could only know if he'd been around when we weren't home. Those details weren't just strange, they were personal, and they made my wife and I start to question how much access we had really given him. One evening, after Mark had supposedly wrapped up for the day, I came home from work and noticed muddy boot prints on the hallway floor. The weird part was that my wife hadn't been home, and the prints didn't match either of our shoes. They led from the back door into the kitchen and stopped near the counter, almost like someone had stood there for a while before leaving. When I asked Mark about it the next morning, he laughed it off, saying maybe we tracked it in without noticing. His tone was casual, but the way he avoided looking directly at me made my stomach knot. Another detail that started gnawing at us was how much he seemed to know about our routines. Mark would mention what shows we watched the night before, or that he noticed we usually ordered pizza on Fridays. None of that was information we shared with him, and it wasn't like we had big windows facing the street. My wife started covering the living room blinds more tightly, but even then, it felt like he still knew things he had no reason to know. The sense of being watched in our own home became harder to shake each day. Things escalated when my wife found him in the backyard one night, long after he should have gone home. She had taken the trash out and saw his silhouette near the shed, holding a flashlight. When she called out, he didn't answer right away. Then he stepped forward, smiling, and said he thought he heard a noise and wanted to check it out for us. The fact that he was on our property at that hour, without asking, made us realize this wasn't just a friendly handyman being helpful. Something about the way he lingered, like he belonged there, left both of us rattled. We decided to confront him more directly the next day, telling him we appreciated his work, but we'd be finishing the rest of the renovations ourselves. Mark nodded, but his reaction didn't match his words. He said, "Of course," and even shook my hand. Yet he stayed standing in our driveway for an uncomfortably long time after we went inside. Through the blinds, I saw him just staring at the house before finally getting into his truck and driving off. That night, neither of us slept well. We both felt like shutting the door on him wouldn't be the end of it. That weekend, the situation finally reached a breaking point. Around midnight, our dog started barking at the back door, the kind of frantic bark that meant someone was out there. When I turned on the porch light, Mark's truck was parked halfway down the alley. I could see him standing near the fence, just staring toward the house. I shouted at him, demanding to know what he was doing, but he didn't answer. He just backed away slowly, slipped into his truck, and drove off without a word. My wife called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. The officers listened and wrote everything down, but without any proof of a crime, they couldn't do much. They suggested we change the locks, install cameras, and call again if he showed up. That night, I barely slept, sitting in the living room with the lights off, watching the front yard through the blinds. Every little sound outside made me tense, expecting him to appear again. It felt like we had invited trouble into our lives the moment we gave him a key to the house during the remodel. We wasted no time the next morning. I replaced every lock, added deadbolts, and installed a security system that same week. My wife insisted we board up the old side gate too, since it never latched right. We told the neighbors to keep an eye out and gave the police a description of his truck. For a few days, I caught myself checking the windows constantly, half expecting to see him leaning against the fence again. But strangely, after that last night, he never came back. It was as if he vanished once he realized we were no longer afraid to involve the police. Even now, years later, I think about how quickly things shifted from relief to fear. A man we trusted to fix our home somehow turned it into a place we no longer felt safe in. I still don't know what his intentions were, whether it was obsession, curiosity, or something worse. All I know is that letting him in once gave him more power than we realized, and it took weeks of anxiety to feel like the house truly belonged to us again. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive to Pennsylvania took us nearly 6 hours, but Kevin and I desperately needed this getaway. We'd been drifting apart for months, both buried in our careers, barely talking beyond logistics about bills and groceries. The lake house rental seemed perfect when I found it online. Isolated, no Wi-Fi, just us and nature for a long weekend in early November. The owner, Mr. Garrett, met us at a gas station 20 miles from the property to hand over the keys. He was maybe 60, wearing a faded flannel shirt with paint stains, and he kept scratching at this peculiar scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw. He mentioned storm season was starting, but assured us the house had weathered worse. The way he counted the cash twice and avoided eye contact should have bothered me more than it did. The property was more remote than the photos suggested. The last 4 miles were just dirt road, cutting through dense forest, no other houses visible anywhere. The lake house itself was older too, with dark wood siding that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Kevin immediately loved the rustic charm, especially the wraparound porch with its heavy wooden railings. Inside, everything was functional but dated. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, furniture that looked inherited rather than purchased. The windows had thick shutters on the inside, which I thought was odd for a rental. While Kevin unloaded our bags, I noticed scratch marks on the inside of the front door, deep grooves near the handle like someone had clawed at the wood. The bedroom upstairs had a strange smell too. Not mold exactly, but something organic and unsettling, like old sweat mixed with fear. Friday evening started peacefully enough. We cooked dinner together for the first time in months. Just pasta and jarred sauce, but it felt like progress. The storm rolled in around 8, faster than expected. First came the wind, making the whole house creak like an old ship. Then the rain, hitting the windows so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. Kevin opened a bottle of wine and we sat by the fireplace, actually talking, really talking, about things that mattered. The thunder started around 9:30, these deep rolling crashes that you could feel in your chest. Between strikes, the house would go completely quiet except for the rain, and in those moments I kept hearing something else, a rhythmic creaking from the porch, too regular to be wind. When I mentioned it to Kevin, he laughed and said, "Old houses make noise. but I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows too. The power died at exactly 10:47. I remember because I was checking my phone for signal when the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed everything instantly. Kevin fumbled for his phone's flashlight while I tried the light switch several times. That pointless reflex we all have. The rain was coming down even harder now, drumming against the roof like it wanted inside. We had seen candles in the kitchen earlier, and Kevin went to get them while I stayed by the dying fire. That's when I heard it clearly. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside the front door. Not the random creaking from before, but the distinct sound of boots on wet wood. I called out to Kevin, trying to keep my voice steady, and he came back with 3 candles and a box of matches. I told him someone was outside, and we both stood there in the flickering candlelight, listening to the footsteps continue around the side of the house. Kevin grabbed the fireplace poker and moved toward the front door, trying to look through the peephole, but it was too dark outside to see anything. The footsteps had stopped somewhere near the back of the house. We waited, breathing shallow, rain pounding overhead. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of hammering. Slow, methodical strikes like someone driving nails into wood. Kevin tried the door handle just to make sure it was locked, but when he twisted it and pulled, the door wouldn't budge. Not locked from our side, it wouldn't open at all. He pulled harder, putting his weight into it, and that's when we realized the door was somehow secured from the outside. The hammering continued, now from a different spot, maybe near the kitchen window. I ran to check the back door while Kevin kept yanking on the front. Same thing. The handle turned, the lock clicked open, but the door itself wouldn't move an inch, like something was barricading it from outside. The next 20 minutes were pure panic disguised as problem solving. We tried every window on the ground floor, and each one had been fitted with boards from the outside. We could see the edges where they met the frame when we held the candles close. The shutters I'd noticed earlier were on the inside, useless for keeping anyone out but perfect for hiding what was being done to the windows from outside. Kevin tried calling 911, but we had no signal, not even a single bar. The landline we'd seen in the kitchen turned out to be just decorative, not connected to anything. The hammering had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the porch. We could hear it clearly through the walls, these long, scraping sounds like someone positioning something large against the doors. Between thunder crashes, we heard whistling, just a casual, cheerful tune like someone doing yard work on a sunny day, completely at odds with what was happening. Kevin decided we needed to try the second-floor windows. We grabbed the candles and rushed upstairs, our shadows dancing wildly on the wood-paneled walls. The master bedroom window faced the lake. If we could break it and jump, it was maybe a 12-foot drop to the ground. Kevin grabbed the bedside lamp and swung it hard against the glass. The window shattered, but behind it was plywood, already nailed in place from outside. He hit it again and again, the lamp base denting the wood but not breaking through. That's when we heard footsteps directly above us on the roof. Slow, careful steps like someone checking their work. Then a man's voice, muffled by the rain but clear enough. "No point wearing yourselves out. Storm's supposed to last until morning." The casualness in his tone made my whole body go rigid. This wasn't random. This person had done this before, had a system, knew exactly how long the storm would last and how long we'd be trapped. I grabbed Kevin's arm and pulled him back downstairs, my mind racing through options. The basement. We hadn't checked the basement. There might be a storm door or cellar entrance. The door to the basement was in the hallway near the kitchen, and we practically fell down the wooden steps in our rush. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and exposed beams lit by our phone flashlights. No windows, no doors, just stored furniture covered in sheets and an old water heater. But in the corner, I spotted something that made my heart race. An old coal chute, a metal door about 3 feet square built into the foundation. Kevin ran over and pushed on it. It moved slightly, not boarded up yet. We could hear the footsteps above us now inside the house, walking through the rooms we'd just left. The person wasn't hurrying, just walking room to room like they were doing an inspection. Kevin shoved the coal chute harder, and it scraped open about a foot before hitting something outside, probably dirt and leaves from years of neglect. The footsteps stopped directly above us. Then we heard dragging sounds again. He was moving something heavy across the floor, positioning it over the basement door. Kevin was frantically digging at the debris blocking the coal chute with his bare hands, dirt falling back into the basement. I found a piece of broken lumber and started helping him clear the opening. The metal door was rusted and sharp around the edges, cutting into our hands as we worked. Above us, the man started talking again, his voice conversational like he was chatting with old friends. Gary and his wife tried the coal chute too, about 3 years back. Made it halfway out before I noticed. The Nguyens just hid in the bedroom closet, found them in under an hour. You folks are doing better than most. The revelation that we weren't the first hit me like ice water. This house, this rental, it was all a trap. How many times had Mr. Garrett met desperate couples at that gas station, counted their cash, given them directions to this nightmare? Kevin managed to clear enough space to squeeze through, though the opening was barely wide enough for a person. He went first, his shoulders scraping against the rusty metal, rain immediately soaking him as his upper body emerged outside. I heard him grunt, pulling himself forward. Then suddenly he screamed, not in pain, but in fury. "There's a chain," he yelled back, his voice strained. "My ankle. There's a chain attached to something." I could hear him thrashing, trying to pull free. The footsteps upstairs moved quickly now, no longer casual. Heavy boots thundered across the floor toward the basement door. I pushed myself into the coal chute behind Kevin, feeling the sharp metal tear through my shirt, my skin. His legs were blocking most of the opening, kicking desperately at something I couldn't see. The chain he'd mentioned was wrapped around his left ankle. It must have been a trap, triggered when someone tried to exit. The basement door above us crashed open, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Kevin's legs and pushed with everything I had, shoving him completely through the opening despite his screams about the chain. The metal scraped more skin off my hands, but I didn't care. I scrambled after him into the pouring rain, landing hard in the mud outside. Kevin was pulling at the chain around his ankle, which led to a metal stake driven deep into the ground about 6 feet from the coal chute. The man appeared in the basement, his flashlight finding us through the opening. In that brief illumination, I saw his face clearly. Not Mr. Garrett, but someone younger, maybe 35, with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked almost bored. He didn't rush. He knew we weren't going anywhere. I grabbed a rock and started hammering at the stake while Kevin pulled the chain taut. The metal stake was solid, professional, like something you'd use to secure a large dog. Behind us, we heard the man climbing back up the basement stairs, taking his time, knowing exactly where we were and how long that stake would hold. The rock wasn't working. Kevin found a broken piece of concrete and together we hammered at the stake base, rain streaming down our faces, hands bleeding and numb. The chain had maybe 4 feet of length. Kevin could stand but couldn't run. We heard the front door open, the barricade being moved from inside. My mind went into pure survival mode. I told Kevin to wrap the chain around his hand and get ready. When the man came around the corner of the house, flashlight leading his way, I threw the concrete chunk at his face. It caught him in the shoulder, spinning him slightly. Kevin yanked the chain hard to the side, pulling the stake at an angle, and it finally gave way, pulling free from the rain-softened ground. We ran. God, we ran like we'd never run before. Kevin dragging 4 feet of chain, me supporting him when he stumbled. The woods were pitch black, branches tearing at our faces, rain blinding us, but we kept going. We could hear him behind us for the first 100 yards, then his footsteps faded. Maybe he knew the woods would do his work for him. Maybe he had other plans. We stumbled and crashed through those woods for what felt like hours until we hit the dirt road, then followed it until we saw headlights. A park ranger doing storm patrol. We were hypothermic, covered in blood and mud, Kevin's ankle torn up from the chain. The ranger called state police immediately. The investigation revealed everything. The real Mr. Garrett had died 2 years earlier. The man we'd met at the gas station was his nephew, Brandon Garrett, who'd been using the property for what police called captivity scenarios. They found evidence of at least 6 other couples in the house. Personal items hidden in the walls, scratch marks we'd missed, dried blood in places we hadn't looked. Brandon had been picking his victims carefully, out-of-state couples having relationship problems, people who'd told family they were going offline for a while, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. He'd watch them for hours, sometimes days, testing their desperation, their relationships, seeing how they'd react under extreme pressure. The police found journals in his truck describing each couple in detail. We were labeled couple number 7. He'd written that Kevin seemed protective but weak, that I was a fighter but too emotional. He'd planned to keep us there through the weekend, watching through hidden cameras we never found, documenting our breakdown. The chain trap was just one of 12 he'd installed around the property for runners. Brandon Garrett was arrested 3 days later at a motel in Ohio. He didn't resist, didn't run, just smiled at the officers and asked if the couple made it out okay. He's serving life without parole now. Kevin and I didn't make it, not as a couple. We tried therapy, tried to process it together, but every time we looked at each other, we were back in that house. He moved to Colorado last spring, started over. I still can't sleep during thunderstorms. I triple-check every lock, research every hotel, every Airbnb obsessively. The detective told me we were lucky, that Brandon had been escalating, that the next couple might not have made it out at all. I don't feel lucky. I feel like we left something in that house, some part of ourselves that we'll never get back. The property was demolished last year, but sometimes I check the spot on Google Maps and I swear I can still see it there, waiting for the next couple number 8. Uncle Jerome had been dead for 2 weeks before anyone thought to tell me about the lake house. I was at my desk in Chicago, scrolling through wedding venue prices that made my stomach hurt, when the lawyer finally tracked me down through my mother. Jerome wasn't someone I really knew, just a name that came up at Christmas sometimes, usually followed by my mom shaking her head and changing the subject. Turns out he'd left me his place up in northern Michigan, near some remote part of Torch Lake, where the closest grocery store was an hour away. My fiancé Nathan thought we'd hit the jackpot when I told him that night. We were drowning in bills, trying to save for a wedding that kept getting more expensive every time we blinked. All we had to do was drive up there, clean the place out, slap a for sale sign on it, and we'd have enough for the honeymoon and maybe even a down payment on a real apartment. 5 days later, we packed Nathan's truck with cleaning supplies and headed north, completely clueless about what was waiting for us in those woods. The property was impossible to find without the hand-drawn map the lawyer had faxed over. 6 hours of driving through progressively smaller towns until civilization just sort of stopped. The last 20 miles were nothing but forest, the kind that's so thick it blocks out the sky even in the middle of the day. Nathan missed the turnoff twice. It was just a gap between 2 ancient pines with trunks wider than our truck. No mailbox, no marker, nothing. The dirt road that led to the house went on for what felt like forever, branches scraping against the windows like fingernails. When we finally broke through the tree line, the lake house sat there like something from another era. 2 stories of dark logs and glass, a wraparound porch with half the railings rotting away, and beyond it, Torch Lake stretching out like black silk. Not a single light visible across the water. No boats, no docks except for the crumbling one in front of us. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. Jerome had lived here alone for 20 years after his wife died, and standing there in that oppressive quiet, I wondered what kind of person chooses that level of isolation. We spent the first hour just walking through the house, trying to make sense of what Jerome had left behind. The place was furnished like time had stopped in 1975. Wood paneling everywhere, orange shag carpet, a kitchen with avocado green appliances that probably belonged in a museum. But it was the details that made me uncomfortable. Every single window had 3 locks on it, including the tiny bathroom window on the 2nd floor. The doors were the same way: deadbolts, chain locks, and these weird sliding bolts at the top and bottom that looked like Jerome had installed them himself. Nathan joked that maybe Jerome was paranoid about bears, but the scratches on the outside of the door frames didn't look like they came from animals. They were too deliberate, too uniform, like someone had been trying to pry their way in with a crowbar or screwdriver. The basement door had it worst of all: 5 different locks and a 2x4 wedged under the handle. We decided to leave that for another day. The whole place smelled like mildew and something else, something sour and organic that seemed to get stronger near the back of the house where Jerome's bedroom was. The first real sign that something was wrong came when we checked the boathouse. It was about 50 feet from the main house, connected by a path of cracked stepping stones overgrown with moss. Nathan noticed the smell first, like spoiled milk mixed with wet dog. Inside, we found the remnants of what looked like someone's meals scattered across the floor. Not old stuff from Jerome, but fresh garbage. Empty cans of beans with the labels peeled off, plastic water bottles crushed and arranged in neat little pyramids, and chicken bones that still had bits of meat on them. The meat was green and crawling with maggots, but it couldn't have been more than a week old. On the walls, someone had carved these symbols that made no sense. Not quite letters, not quite pictures, just these repetitive marks that covered every wooden surface from floor to ceiling. Nathan counted over 300 of them before he gave up. The really disturbing part was the makeshift bed in the corner, a pile of life jackets arranged into a nest, covered with a tarp that was stained with something dark. Whoever had been sleeping there had also collected things from the main house. We found Jerome's missing tools arranged in a perfect circle around the bed: hammers, screwdrivers, a rusty hatchet, all pointing inward like some kind of shrine. Nathan wanted to call the police right then, but I convinced him to wait until morning. It was already getting dark, and the closest station was at least an hour away. We figured whoever had been squatting there was long gone, probably cleared out when they heard Jerome had died. We went back to the main house, locked every single door and window, suddenly grateful for Jerome's paranoid security system, and tried to settle in for the night. Nathan started a fire in the living room fireplace while I went through Jerome's papers in the study, looking for information about the property sale. That's when I found his journals. Dozens of them, going back 15 years, all filled with the same cramped handwriting. The recent entries were what caught my attention. Jerome wrote about them constantly, never saying who they were, just that they came at night, that they watched from the water, that they wanted inside. The last entry was dated 3 days before he died. They're getting bolder. Found footprints on the porch this morning, 6 toes on the left foot. They're not trying to hide anymore. I showed Nathan and we both tried to laugh it off. Old man living alone in the woods, probably dementia setting in. But neither of us could explain the wet footprints we'd noticed on the porch when we arrived, or why one of them had 6 toe marks. The scratching started around midnight. At first I thought it was just branches against the house. God knows there were enough trees around. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 pause, always in sets of 3. Nathan grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, trying to see what was making the noise. The beam barely penetrated 10 feet into the darkness before being swallowed up by the trees. The scratching moved around the house slowly, stopping at each window like something was testing them. We followed the sound from room to room, Nathan clutching a baseball bat he'd found in the closet, me holding my phone with 911 already dialed but not yet called. The sound stopped at the back door, the one leading to Jerome's bedroom. We stood there in the hallway, barely breathing, waiting. Then the doorknob turned. Just once, very slowly, like someone was checking if it was locked. Nathan yelled out that we had a gun, we didn't, and that we'd already called the cops, we hadn't. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, Nathan's knuckles white around the bat before we heard footsteps on the deck. Not running, not hurried, just calm, measured steps walking away. Except the footsteps had this weird rhythm to them, like whoever was walking had an injured leg or was dragging something. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the living room with every light in the house on, taking turns watching the windows. Around 3 a.m., Nathan spotted something moving near the dock. 3 figures just standing at the edge of the water, facing the house. They were too far away to make out any details, but something about their proportions seemed wrong. Their arms hung down past where their knees should be, and their heads looked too small for their bodies. They stood there for almost an hour, perfectly still, before one of them made this sound. Not quite a whistle, not quite a scream, but something in between that made every hair on my body stand up. The others responded with the same call, and then they just walked backward into the lake. Not turned around and walked in, but walked backward without looking, until the water swallowed them up. Nathan wanted to leave right then, just get in the truck and drive. But I reminded him that meant going outside, walking 50 feet to where we'd parked, with those things somewhere out there in the darkness. We decided to wait for sunrise, then get out fast. I started gathering Jerome's important papers while Nathan kept watch, both of us counting down the minutes until dawn. The sun finally came up around 6:30, and everything looked different in the daylight. Normal, almost peaceful. We could see the whole lake, empty except for a few loons floating near the shore. Nathan did a quick walk around the house while I loaded our bags into the truck. He found more footprints, lots of them, all around the house and leading down to the water. But the weird thing was that some of them were normal, 5-toed human prints, while others had that 6th toe, and still others looked like someone had been walking on their hands. There were marks on all the windows where they'd been tested, and the locked basement door had fresh scratches all around the deadbolt. We were throwing the last of our stuff in the truck when Nathan noticed the hood was open about an inch. He popped it fully, and that's when we saw that someone had removed the battery cables and tied them in elaborate knots. Not cut them, not torn them, but carefully knotted them in these complex patterns that must have taken at least an hour to create. The spare tire was gone too, and in its place was a pile of those same carved symbols from the boathouse, made from twisted pieces of metal that looked like they'd been pulled from the dock. Nathan's phone had no signal, and mine was completely dead even though I'd charged it the night before. The landline in the house had been cut. We found the wire pulled out from the external box and braided into more of those intricate patterns. We were trapped, at least until we could fix the truck or walk the 5 miles to the main road. Nathan started working on unknotting the battery cables while I went back inside to look for tools that might help. That's when I noticed Jerome's journals were gone, all of them, even though I'd stacked them on the kitchen table just hours before. In their place was a single piece of paper with a message written in what looked like mud or clay. He invited us. The lake remembers. You can't sell what was promised. The handwriting was bizarre, like someone had tried to write with their non-dominant hand or maybe with their foot. Some letters were backward, others were symbols I didn't recognize. While I was staring at this message, Nathan started yelling from outside. Not scared yelling, but frustrated. Someone had filled the gas tank with lake water while we were inside. We could see it dripping out from under the truck, muddy and full of algae. The police finally arrived around 2 p.m., after Nathan had walked 2 miles down the dirt road and found enough signal to call. 2 officers from the county sheriff's department, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They took one look at the boathouse and called for backup, said it was the 3rd property they'd seen like this in the past month. The older cop, Officer Daniels, pulled me aside while his partner photographed everything. He told me that there had been reports going back decades about a group of people living in the woods around Torch Lake. Not quite a family, not quite a cult, but something in between. They supposedly had birth defects from generations of isolation, extra digits, elongated limbs, problems with their vocal cords that made them sound inhuman. The state had tried to intervene in the 80s, but they could never find them. They lived somewhere out in the wetlands, moving between abandoned properties, surviving on fish and whatever they could steal. Daniels said Jerome had been reporting encounters for years, but nobody took him seriously until recently, when other property owners started calling in similar stories. The really messed up part was what he said next. These people seemed to believe that certain properties belonged to them by some ancient right, and they got aggressive when outsiders tried to claim them. Officer Daniels offered to escort us out, said he'd have a tow truck meet us at the main road. While we were packing up the last of our things, his partner found something in the basement that even made these seasoned cops go pale. Remember that door with 5 locks that we never opened? Behind it was Jerome's real bedroom. He'd been sleeping in the basement for who knows how long. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all taken from the woods looking into the house. Pictures of Jerome cooking, reading, sleeping. Some were recent, but others went back years based on how young Jerome looked in them. The disturbing part was that in some of the photos, you could see the photographer's reflection in the window, elongated shadows with those distinctive 6-fingered hands pressed against the glass. Jerome had written dates on the back of each photo, documenting when they were taken. The most recent batch was from the week before he died, and in those, you could see multiple figures in the reflections. They'd been getting bolder, just like his journal said. Daniels bagged everything as evidence and told us we were lucky we'd only stayed one night. The previous owner of another property, an elderly woman named Ruth, had lasted 3 nights before they found her wandering the main road, talking about people who walked like spiders and spoke in whistles. We left that afternoon with a police escort, Nathan's truck on the back of a flatbed, our engagement rings feeling stupid on our fingers after what we'd been through. The sheriff's department opened an investigation, but Officer Daniels called me a week later to say they'd found nothing. The boathouse had been completely cleaned out, all the symbols painted over with fresh white paint that was still wet when they arrived. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. He advised us to sell the property through a broker and never go back. We took his advice, but the sale fell through 3 times. Each potential buyer reported the same thing: strange sounds from the lake at night, things moving in the woods, and always that feeling of being watched. The property is still in my name technically, but I'll never go back. Nathan and I called off the wedding 6 months later. We never talked about why, but I think we both knew that some experiences either bond you forever or break you apart. And what happened at that lake broke something fundamental between us. Sometimes I get calls from the current caretaker the state assigned to check on the property. He never says much, just that they're still around and that he's found more of those symbols carved into new places. Last month he sent me a photo of the dock where someone had arranged hundreds of 6-toed footprints in the mud, all pointing toward the house. The message is clear. They're waiting. The lake remembers. And someday someone will be foolish enough to try to live there again. The deadline was killing me. 6 months to finish a book about corruption in local politics, and I hadn't written a single decent chapter. That's why I drove up to Maine last September, renting this lake house through a sketchy website that hadn't been updated since 2008. The owner, Mrs. Holloway, met me at a gas station 20 miles away to hand over the keys, said she didn't like going near the property anymore, but wouldn't elaborate. The place was perfect though. A cedar-shingled cabin tucked between pine trees, about 50 yards from the water's edge. No neighbors for at least a mile in either direction. The nearest town, Millfield, was a 40-minute drive through winding forest roads. Just me, my laptop, and enough instant coffee to fuel a small army. The first night around 11 I heard it while reviewing interview transcripts. Music drifting across the water, maybe acoustic guitars, voices harmonizing. The sound was so faint I had to strain to make it out through the double-pane windows. I figured some college kids were camping on the opposite shore, probably sitting around a fire with their guitars. The lake was huge, almost 3 miles across at its widest point, and sound carries strangely over water. I actually found it kind of pleasant, this distant reminder that other people existed. By midnight, it had stopped, and I worked until 3 in the morning, making real progress for the first time in weeks. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Wednesday night, the music started earlier, around 9:30. This time it seemed louder, though still muffled and dreamlike. 3 voices, I thought. 2 higher, 1 lower, weaving together in these long, sustained notes that didn't quite match any song I knew. The melody kept shifting, never quite resolving, like they were improvising or working through something unfinished. I walked out onto the deck with a beer, trying to spot a campfire across the water, but the far shore was just a black line against the stars. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and I couldn't imagine anyone camping in that cold. After about an hour, the singing faded out gradually, like someone slowly turning down a volume knob. I went back inside and tried to focus on my chapter about kickbacks in the highway department, but I kept finding myself listening for the voices to start again. By Friday, I was genuinely puzzled. The music had come every single night, always starting a little earlier, always lasting a bit longer. That evening it began just after sunset, maybe 7 o'clock, and this time it was unmistakably closer. Not from across the lake anymore, but somewhere along my side of the shore. The harmonies were clearer now, and there was something unsettling about how perfectly the 3 voices matched each other, like they'd been singing together for years. No instruments this time, just those voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to my dock, scanning the tree line in both directions. Nothing, no boats, no lights, no movement. The singing continued for nearly 2 hours, and I swear at certain moments it sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once, as if the singers were slowly circling the property. Saturday morning, I drove into Millfield for supplies and stopped at the local library. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with thick glasses and a cardigan despite the warm day, seemed to recognize me immediately. "You're staying at the Holloway place," she said, not a question. When I asked about the property's history, she disappeared into a back room and returned with a manila folder stuffed with newspaper clippings. The cabin had been built in 1967 by a man named Arthur Brennan, who taught music at the regional high school. He'd used it as a weekend retreat where he gave private lessons to advanced students. In April 1994, Brennan had gone missing along with 2 of his students, a 17-year-old girl named Melissa Crane and an 18-year-old boy named Jason Dufresne. Their cars were found at the cabin, doors open, keys still in the ignitions. No bodies were ever recovered from the lake, despite a 3-week search involving divers and sonar equipment. The librarian leaned in closer, glancing around the empty library as if someone might overhear. "Brennan was obsessed with something called shape note singing," she explained. "It's an old American tradition, sacred music mainly, but he had his own ideas about it. Said he could use harmonics to affect brain waves, consciousness, that kind of thing. The parents of those kids found recordings in his classroom after he disappeared. Hours and hours of the 3 of them singing these bizarre arrangements he'd written." She photocopied several articles for me, including one with a grainy photo of Brennan, a thin man with hollow cheeks and intense eyes, standing between 2 teenagers in matching navy sweaters. The girl had long dark hair parted in the middle. The boy was tall and angular with a nervous smile. All 3 were holding sheet music, and behind them, I could make out the blurred edge of what looked like the same dock I'd stood on the night before. I spent the rest of Saturday researching Brennan online, finding fragments of information scattered across old forums and archived websites. He'd self-published a pamphlet in 1993 called Harmonic Resonance and Human Consciousness, which described his theories about using specific vocal frequencies to induce altered states. A few copies had survived in university libraries, and someone had scanned pages showing complex musical notations with handwritten notes in the margins. Things like neural entrainment at 783 Hz and binaural effect requires precise positioning. That night, The singing started at dusk, and this time I was ready with my phone recording. The voices were so clear now that I could hear individual breathing patterns between phrases, the subtle scratch of throat clearing, even what sounded like footsteps on gravel. But when I played back the recording later, all I got was static and the sound of wind through trees, even though the night had been perfectly still. Sunday, I couldn't concentrate on writing at all. I kept thinking about those 3 people, wondering what exactly had happened here in 1994. The singing began in late afternoon, while the sun was still bright on the water, and for the first time I could make out actual words, or at least syllables that might have been words in some language I didn't recognize. The voices seemed to be coming from underneath the cabin now, impossible as that was since it sat on a concrete foundation. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear to the floor. The sound vibrated through the wood, making my teeth ache. Around 8 o'clock, something new happened. The 3 voices split apart, each one moving to a different part of the property. One stayed beneath the cabin, one drifted toward the dock, and one circled through the trees. They continued singing to each other across the distance, their harmonies creating interference patterns that made my vision blur and my balance waver. Stumbled outside, nauseated and disoriented, just as all 3 voices suddenly stopped mid-note, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Monday morning I packed my laptop and notes, ready to leave, but something made me check the crawl space under the cabin first. Call it morbid curiosity or journalistic instinct. The access panel was behind a stack of old life jackets in the storage closet. When I pried it open, a smell hit me, musty and organic like wet paper and something else I couldn't identify. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness and saw them immediately. Dozens of cassette tapes scattered across the dirt floor, their labels faded but still partially legible. Dates from 1993 and 1994. Names: Melissa, scale work; Jason, breathing X; 3, all 3, convergence pattern. My hands trembled as I grabbed a few and retreated back into the cabin. The old boombox in the kitchen still worked, and when I pressed play on the first tape, those same 3 voices filled the room. Younger, less refined, but unmistakably the same harmonies I'd been hearing all week. The second tape was different. Brennan's voice speaking alone. Day 43 of vocal conditioning. The students are progressing beyond my expectations. The resonance points we've discovered in this location are remarkable. The lake bed's mineral composition, the specific acoustic properties of the cedar walls, even the elevation creates perfect conditions. We're approaching something unprecedented here. The boundaries are becoming fluid. Then singing again, but this time with Brennan's voice providing instruction between phrases. Feel the vibration in your sternum, Melissa. Jason, lower your larynx slightly. Yes, that's it. Now hold that frequency while I... The tape cut to static, then picked up mid-session with all 3 voices locked in a pattern that made my skull feel like it was being squeezed in a vice. I turned it off, but the echo continued in my ears, in my bones, in the wooden beams of the cabin itself. When I looked outside, the late morning sun on the lake seemed wrong somehow, the light bending at angles that water shouldn't create. The final tape I grabbed was labeled simply, "Success, do not distribute." Brennan's voice was excited, almost manic. We've done it. The harmonic convergence point lasted 90 seconds this time. The students experienced simultaneous consciousness. They could perceive through each other's senses, share thoughts without speaking. The frequency pattern is imprinted now, embedded in the wood, the foundation, the very air around this place. Even when we're not here, the resonance continues. It calls to us. We're returning tonight for the final phase. The recording ended with all 3 voices beginning that same elaborate pattern I'd been hearing all week. But this time there was something else in the background. A 4th voice, or maybe an echo, or maybe the sound of the cabin itself learning the song. I grabbed the tapes and ran to my car, not bothering to pack anything else. As I drove away, I could see Mrs. Holloway's other rental properties along the lake road, all of them dark and apparently vacant despite this being peak season. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm writing this from my apartment in Boston, trying to make sense of what happened. The tapes are sitting in a box in my closet. I can't bring myself to throw them away or listen to them again. Here's the thing that really gets me. I called the library in Millfield yesterday, and the librarian told me something she hadn't mentioned during my visit. After Brennan and his students disappeared, there were 4 other groups of 3 people who went missing from that property over the years. Always musicians or singers who'd rented the place, always vanishing without a trace. The locals stopped talking about it because it hurt property values. Mrs. Holloway keeps renting it out through that old website, always to people from out of state who don't know the history. Sometimes I wake up at night and hear those 3 voices in the distance, even though I'm 300 miles away now. They're getting clearer, more insistent, like they're calling me back. The worst part is that I find myself humming along, knowing exactly which note comes next, as if the pattern has been carved into some deep part of my brain that I can't consciously control. Last August, I packed up my 2 kids and drove 6 hours to a lake house in Oregon, desperate for some peace after the divorce finalized. The place belonged to my college roommate's family, tucked away on the edge of Crater Lake's lesser-known cousin, one of those spots where cell service dies about 20 minutes before you arrive. My daughter Chloe was 12, constantly buried in her fantasy novels, and my son Ethan had just turned 8, still young enough to think a weekend without Wi-Fi was an adventure rather than a punishment. The lake house sat on stilts, weather-beaten cedar shingles and windows facing the water, surrounded by Douglas firs so thick you could barely see the gravel road we'd driven in on. We'd arrived Friday afternoon under clear skies, spent Saturday hiking and roasting marshmallows, completely unaware that the weather forecast had shifted dramatically overnight. Sunday morning brought clouds so dark they turned the lake the color of old motor oil, and by noon the rain was coming down in sheets that bent the tree branches nearly horizontal. The kids and I were playing Monopoly on the living room floor, the old wood-burning stove crackling beside us, when someone knocked on the door, 3 heavy thuds that echoed through the house. I remember glancing at my watch, 2:47 p.m. Through the front window I could make out a figure hunched against the rain, water streaming off what looked like a yellow raincoat. When I opened the door, keeping the chain latched, I found myself looking at a man maybe 45 years old, his gray hair plastered to his skull, water pooling around his hiking boots. He had these pale blue eyes, almost silver in the stormlight, and a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, white against his weathered skin. His raincoat was torn at the shoulder and his hands were trembling. Whether from cold or something else I couldn't tell. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry to bother you," he said, his voice hoarse like he'd been yelling over the wind. "My boat flipped about a quarter mile out, got caught in the storm trying to get back to the marina. I barely made it to shore." He gestured vaguely behind him toward the lake, though through the rain I couldn't see past the tree line. "I saw your lights from the water. I know this is strange, but could I come in just long enough to warm up? Maybe use your phone to call for a ride?" Something about the way he kept wiping his hands on his soaked jeans, over and over, made me hesitate. But then Ethan appeared beside me, curious as always, and the man's face shifted into this warm, grandfatherly smile that made me feel guilty for my suspicion. Against every horror movie rule I'd ever screamed at characters for breaking, I unlatched the chain. "Just for a few minutes," I said, stepping aside. "You can sit by the fire." He stepped inside with this odd carefulness, like he was memorizing the layout, eyes scanning the living room, the hallway leading to the bedrooms, the kitchen entrance. Water dripped steadily from his clothes onto the hardwood, forming a puddle that reflected the firelight. "Beautiful place," he said, moving straight to the wood stove without invitation, holding his hands out to the heat. "You folks live here year-round?" I explained we were just visiting for the weekend, immediately regretting how much information I was volunteering. Chloe had retreated to the couch with her book, but she kept glancing up at him with that teenage wariness she'd developed lately. The man introduced himself as Douglas, no last name, just Douglas, and began describing his supposed accident in detail, how the storm came out of nowhere, how his 16-foot aluminum boat got swamped by a rogue wave, how he'd clung to a cooler until he could swim to shore. The whole time he talked, his eyes kept drifting to the hallway, and twice he asked seemingly innocent questions that made my chest tighten. These old places must have been built before modern locks, huh? And, your husband out getting supplies before the roads flood? I told him my phone was in the kitchen and excused myself, leaving him by the fire with my kids just 15 feet away, a decision that still makes me nauseous when I think about it. In the kitchen, I grabbed my cell but found exactly what I expected. No signal. The landline on the wall was old but functional, and I picked it up, ready to call 911, or at least the marina to verify his story. But as I started dialing, I could hear Douglas talking to Ethan in the living room, asking him about his favorite hiding spots in the house, whether he'd explored all the rooms yet. My finger hovered over the numbers as I heard him say, "Bet you and your sister have your own rooms here." Lucky kids. Which one has the better view? The casualness of it, the way he was fishing for information while I was out of sight, made my mouth go dry. I hung up quietly and moved to the kitchen window that faced the shoreline, straining to see through the rain for any sign of a capsized boat, debris, anything that would confirm his story. The lake was choppy, whitecaps visible even through the downpour, but there was nothing else. No overturned hull, no floating cooler, no indication anyone had been out on that water. When I returned to the living room, Douglas had moved from the stove and was standing by our front door, examining the deadbolt with his fingers. "Old Schläge," he said without looking at me. "These can be tricky in weather like this. The wood swells, makes them stick. You folks having any trouble with it?" Ethan was showing him his collection of rocks he'd found on our hike yesterday, completely oblivious to the way Douglas kept touching things, the door frame, the window locks, the light switches, like he was taking inventory. "Did you reach anyone?" he asked. And when I lied and said the phones were down, his mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite relief, but close enough to make me step between him and my children. "That's unfortunate," he said, moving back toward the fire. "Guess I'll have to wait out the storm here. These things can last hours, sometimes all night." The assumption that he was staying, the way he just invited himself to remain in our space, sent a cold prickle down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The next hour crawled by with excruciating slowness, while Douglas made himself increasingly comfortable in our space. He'd found a towel in the bathroom without asking, dried his hair with it, and draped his raincoat over a chair he'd pulled unnecessarily close to where Chloe was reading. Every few minutes he'd make these observations that sounded innocent, but felt like reconnaissance. "No neighbors for what, half a mile? Must be peaceful." Or, "That back door leads straight to the dock, right? Easy access." When Ethan mentioned we'd gone swimming yesterday morning, Douglas perked up and asked if we'd seen any other boats, any fishermen, anyone at all who might have noticed us there. The question hung in the air like smoke, and I found myself lying again, saying yes. We'd waved to several boats, lots of people knew we were here. His expression didn't change, but he started drumming his fingers on his knee in this rapid, agitated rhythm that he hadn't been doing before. Around 4 p.m., he stood abruptly and announced he needed to use the bathroom. But instead of going to the one in the hallway, he walked straight toward the back of the house where the bedrooms were. "First door on the left," I called out, my voice sharp enough that Chloe looked up from her book. But I could hear him walking past the bathroom, his footsteps creaking on the old floorboards as he continued down the hall. I followed quickly, finding him in the doorway of the kids' room, studying the window that faced the woods. "Just checking if I could see the marina from here," he said when he noticed me behind him. "Sometimes you can spot the lights when the rain lets up." But there was no marina in that direction. I knew because we'd driven around the entire lake yesterday. The marina was east. This window faced west into dense forest. "Bathroom's back here," I said firmly, and something in my tone must have finally registered because he nodded and retreated. But as he passed me in the narrow hallway, he paused just long enough to say, "Your girl's about my daughter's age. 12, 13. They grow up so fast, I'd never told him Chloe's age." The bathroom door closed with a soft click, but I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to the rain hammering the roof and trying to convince myself I was overreacting, that maybe Ethan had mentioned his sister's age, that maybe I was just being paranoid. When Douglas emerged from the bathroom, he'd washed his face and hands, but there were muddy boot prints leading all the way to the bathroom that hadn't been there before, like he'd walked outside and come back in while we weren't watching. Except he'd been inside the whole time, hadn't he? I grabbed cleaning supplies from under the kitchen sink, using it as an excuse to follow his trail, and that's when I noticed the back door's deadbolt was unlocked. I distinctly remembered checking all the locks when the storm started. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it over the rain as I casually relocked it, then suggested to the kids that we should play a board game in their room. Anything to get them away from Douglas. But he intercepted Ethan in the hallway, crouching down to the boy's level with that same grandfatherly smile. "Hey, buddy, before you go, did you happen to see where your mom keeps the flashlights? Power goes out a lot in storms like this." Ethan, eager to be helpful, started to explain that there was one in the kitchen drawer, one in Mom's room, and a big lantern in the closet by the back door. Douglas nodded along, memorizing every detail, and that's when I saw it. A small handheld marine radio clipped inside his raincoat pocket, the LED power indicator glowing green. If his boat had capsized, if he'd barely survived swimming to shore, why was his radio completely dry and functional? The moment crystallized everything. I scooped up Ethan mid-sentence, told Chloe we were playing hide-and-seek right now, and herded them into my bedroom. Douglas stood slowly, that grandfather mask slipping just enough for me to see something calculating underneath. "Everything okay?" he asked, taking a step toward us. I managed to smile, said the kids had been begging to play all weekend, and closed the bedroom door. My hands fumbled with the old push-button lock, the flimsy kind that could be opened with a bobby pin, but it was better than nothing. I whispered to the kids to stay quiet, that we were going to play a different game. Whoever could stay silent the longest would win. Chloe's face had gone pale. She was old enough to understand something was wrong. From the other side of the door, I could hear Douglas's footsteps, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside. The doorknob turned gently, testing. "Hey," he called through the door, his voice different now, lower, without the false warmth. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Why don't you come out and we can talk about this?" The handle jiggled harder, then nothing. Silence except for the rain. I pressed my ear to the door and heard him moving away, but not toward the living room, toward the back door. The one I'd just relocked. The one Ethan had just told him led straight to the dock. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911, not caring that there was no signal. Maybe somehow emergency calls would go through. Nothing. The landline was in the kitchen, impossible to reach without leaving the bedroom. We were trapped. Then I remembered the car keys in my pocket. I whispered to the kids that we were going to run to the car on the count of 3, no matter what. Chloe grabbed Ethan's hand and I slowly turned the lock, easing the door open. The hallway was empty, but I could hear sounds from the back of the house, the scraping of metal on metal, like someone working at a lock. We crept toward the front door, and I could see Douglas through the back window, crouched at the door with something in his hand, completely focused on whatever he was doing. We made it to the front door, and I fumbled with the deadbolt that now seemed impossibly loud. It clicked open, and we burst out into the storm. The rain hit us like a wall, instantly soaking through our clothes, but we ran for the car parked 30 feet away. I jammed the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I threw it in reverse just as Douglas came around the side of the house, no longer pretending to be injured or weak. He moved with purpose, almost reaching us before I gunned it backward down the gravel drive, the car sliding in the mud, but finding traction. We drove through the storm for 20 minutes before finding cell service, and I immediately called 911. The police met us at a gas station in town. 2 officers who took our report with increasing concern when I described the man. They sent units to the lake house immediately. What they found still makes me sick to think about. There was no capsized boat, no accident, no maritime emergency. But there were fresh footprints around the entire perimeter of the house from earlier that day, before the knock on the door. Tool marks on the bathroom window frame. And in the woods behind the house, a truck with California plates hidden under a tarp, registered to a man named Douglas Brenner, who'd been released from prison 6 months earlier after serving 8 years for home invasion and assault. The Marine radio I'd seen? The police said he probably used it to monitor when families arrived at vacation rentals, listening for their check-in calls to property managers. We weren't random. We were chosen. Watched. He'd been waiting for the storm, for the isolation, for the perfect opportunity. The officers found rope in his truck, zip ties, and a notebook with addresses of lakefront rentals all around Oregon. Ours was circled with a note. Single mother, 2 kids, no dogs. To this day, I don't know how long he'd been watching us before he knocked on that door. It was spring break 2017, and the 6 of us had pooled together what little money we had left after textbooks and ramen to rent this dirt-cheap lake house in upstate New York. I was finishing my junior year at SUNY Albany, drowning in student loans and desperately needing a break from my part-time job at the campus bookstore. My roommate Trevor had found the listing on Airbnb. $40 a night split 6 ways for a whole lake house seemed too good to pass up. The place was about 3 hours north of campus, nestled between thick pine forests and this murky lake that locals called Heron's Rest. Trevor, his girlfriend Madison, my buddy Carlos from Cal C class, and these 2 girls from our dorm floor, Jenna and Britt, all crammed into Carlos's beat-up Suburban on a Friday afternoon, ready to forget about finals for a week. The lake house looked nothing like the photos when we pulled up around sunset. The wooden siding was this sickly green color, like pond scum had been painted over and left to peel for decades. The deck wrapped around 3 sides, but half the railings were missing, and the dock stretching into the water had gaps between the planks wide enough to lose your phone through. But we were 21 and stupid, more concerned with the cases of beer in the trunk than the state of our accommodations. The key was hidden under a fake rock by the front door, one of those obvious plastic ones you'd buy at Home Depot. The inside smelled like mothballs and something else, something earthy and damp that made me think of my grandmother's root cellar. Madison immediately started opening windows while Trevor hauled in the coolers, and within an hour we had music blasting and red Solo cups scattered across every surface. Around 10 that night, we were all pretty buzzed and playing some drinking game Carlos had made up, involving cards and embarrassing questions, when Jenna's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face scrunched up in this confused way. "That's weird," she said, holding up her screen. "Someone just texted me, nice pink tank top, but you should probably close the kitchen window behind you." We all laughed because Jenna was wearing a pink tank top and had just come back from the kitchen. But then she got this look on her face. "Guys, I don't have any service up here. How did this come through?" The number had a 5118 area code, local to this region. Trevor grabbed her phone and tried calling it back, but it just rang and rang. We figured it was probably the owner checking in. Maybe they had cameras or something, though nobody remembered seeing any. 20 minutes later, Carlos was out on the deck taking a leak off the side. Classy, I know, when his phone lit up. The text read, "Third plank from the left is loose. Careful you don't fall through." He came bursting back inside, face pale under his stubble, holding his phone like it was contaminated. "Which one of you is messing with me?" But we were all there in the living room, phones visible on the coffee table or in pockets. That's when things started to feel wrong, like the air in the room had gotten heavier. Madison suggested maybe it was locals playing pranks on tourists, which made sense until she pointed out something that made my chest tighten. How would they know our numbers? We literally just got here. The music was still playing, but nobody was dancing anymore. Britt turned it down and we all just sat there looking at each other, waiting for someone to have a logical explanation. Then my phone vibrated. The message made my mouth go dry. Check the basement door behind the water heater. The lock's been broken for years. Anyone could walk right in. I hadn't even noticed there was a basement. Trevor and Carlos went to investigate while the girls huddled together on the couch. They found the door exactly where the text described, tucked behind this ancient rust-stained water heater in a utility closet we hadn't even opened yet. The padlock hung there, sheared clean through like someone had used bolt cutters. The wooden door opened to narrow stairs disappearing into pure black. Carlos shined his phone flashlight down there, and we could see footprints in the dust. Fresh ones, going both down and back up. "We're leaving," Madison announced, already grabbing her purse. But Trevor, trying to be the tough guy, insisted we search the house first. "If someone's hiding here, we need to know," he said, though his voice cracked a little. We split into pairs and searched every room, every closet, under every bed. The house had this weird layout with rooms that connected in unexpected ways. A bathroom with 2 doors, a closet that opened into another bedroom, a hallway that dead-ended at a wall with a small hatch near the floor. Jenna and I were checking the master bedroom when we found something that made us both stop breathing for a second. On the dusty dresser, someone had drawn a smiley face, and underneath it, 6 tally marks. 6 of us. The dust around it was undisturbed except for those finger marks, fresh and deliberate. That's when Britt screamed from downstairs. We rushed down to find her staring at her phone, trembling. The new message read, "You missed the attic access in the hall closet. I'm disappointed. I thought college kids were supposed to be smart." Trevor yanked open the hall closet so hard the door bounced off the wall. Behind a row of moldy life jackets, there it was, a square cutout in the ceiling with a rope hanging down. The rope looked new, bright white against the yellowed walls like someone had recently replaced it. We could hear something up there, a subtle creaking that wasn't quite in rhythm with the wind outside. "Call 911, Madison said, but our phones had no signal for calls, only these texts kept coming through somehow. Carlos tried using the landline in the kitchen, but the line was dead, just this soft clicking sound when you picked up the receiver. We were 40 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by dark forest and that black lake. Trevor and Carlos pulled down the attic access and a ladder unfolded. The smell that wafted down was overwhelming. Body odor, rotting food, and something chemical like old batteries. Trevor climbed up first with his phone light, then immediately came back down, his face completely drained of color. "Someone's been living up there," he whispered. "There's a sleeping bag, empty food cans, bottles filled with liquid, and photos. Dozens of photos taped to the beams." Before anyone could respond, all 6 of our phones buzzed simultaneously. The message was longer this time. The previous renters were fun too. The family in January only lasted 3 hours before they ran. The couple in December made it through the night but left their dog behind. "Don't worry, I fed him. You're doing better than most. The secret is knowing all the ways in and out, like the crawl space that connects the basement to the dock storage, or the panel in the back of the bedroom closet that opens to the attic. Or my favorite, the old dumbwaiter behind the kitchen wall that still works if you know which board to push." Madison started crying, and honestly, I was close to joining her. This person had been here the whole time, had been watching other renters, had made this place his sick little game. Jenna was already at the door with her keys, but when she turned the deadbolt, it wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed, stuffed with something from the outside. Carlos grabbed a kitchen chair and smashed it through the living room window. The glass exploded outward and cold air rushed in, but as he was clearing the remaining shards, another text arrived. "Breaking things costs extra. The owner will add it to your bill. $200 for the window, $50 for the chair. I keep track of everything." That detail, keeping track of damages, made it suddenly real in this mundane, horrible way. This wasn't just some creep. This person had access to the rental account, knew the owner, maybe was the owner. Trevor was already helping Madison through the broken window when we heard footsteps above us, slow and deliberate, walking from one end of the attic to the other. Then a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The attic access ladder started to retract on its own, folding up into the ceiling. Someone was pulling it up from inside. "Go, go, go," Trevor shouted, practically throwing Britt through the window opening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I helped Jenna through, her hands slick with sweat and shaking. We ran to Carlos's Suburban, feet crunching on the gravel driveway, nobody looking back at the house. The keys were shaking in Carlos's hand as he tried to start the engine. It turned over once, twice, then nothing. The battery was dead. That's when we noticed the hood was slightly popped, like someone had been under there. My phone lit up again. I disconnected a few things. Walking to town might be good exercise, though the woods get pretty confusing at night. People have gotten lost for days. Trevor was already on the ground, sliding under the vehicle with his phone light, trying to see what had been tampered with. Madison was on the verge of hyperventilating, and Britt was trying to flag down any cars on the remote road, but nothing had passed since we'd arrived. That's when I noticed movement in the house. A silhouette in the broken living room window, just standing there watching us scramble around the dead vehicle. The figure raised something to their ear, a phone, and all 6 of our phones buzzed one final time. The owner keeps a spare key in a magnetic box under the generator shed. The generator has enough fuel to run for 3 days. The shed locks from the inside. Choose wisely. It was a trap or it was help, but either way we needed shelter and a way to call for help. The generator would mean power, maybe internet, maybe a way out of this nightmare. Carlos spotted the shed about 50 yards away, barely visible in the darkness. We moved as a group, nobody wanting to separate, our phone lights creating shifting shadows between the trees. The magnetic box was exactly where the text said, containing a single brass key. Inside the shed was an old diesel generator, some gas cans, tools, and miracle of miracles, an old corded phone mounted on the wall. Trevor grabbed it and got a dial tone. His fingers were shaking as he punched in 911. We could hear the operator answer, Trevor frantically explaining our location, the break-in, the stalking, everything pouring out in a jumbled rush. The police arrived 45 minutes later, the longest 45 minutes of my life. We stayed locked in that shed, taking turns watching through the small window as flashlight beams searched the house. They found the attic setup, the basement entrance, all the hidden passages the texts had described, but they never found him. The officer told us the house had been a problem property for years. Complaints from renters about feeling watched, items moved, strange sounds. The owner, some investment company in Florida, just kept lowering the price and paying off anyone who complained too loudly. They towed Carlos's Suburban to town, where a mechanic fixed what turned out to be just disconnected battery cables and a removed fuse. We drove straight through the night back to Albany. Nobody sleeping, nobody talking about what happened. The next week I saw the lake house was still listed on Airbnb. The price dropped to $30 a night. The review section had been wiped clean. Sometimes I still get random texts from 518 numbers, just single words like remember or visit again. I never respond. I changed my number eventually, moved to Arizona after graduation, got a normal job, a normal life. But every time I pass a lake or see an Airbnb listing for some too cheap remote property, my chest gets tight and I remember that silhouette in the window, just standing there, like he owned the place. Maybe he did. July in Vermont hits different than anywhere else I've been, and we'd been planning this lake house getaway since March, when my wife Angela found the listing online. I'm an accountant at a firm downtown. She teaches 4th grade, and between our jobs and raising 2 kids, We desperately needed these 2 weeks away from everything. Our son Tommy had just turned 8 that spring, and our daughter Lily was 13 going on 30, complete with the eye rolls and the constant texting with her friends. We arrived at the rental around 4 on a Friday afternoon. This beautiful cedar-sided place nestled right on Lake Champlain's eastern shore, surrounded by these towering pines that made the air smell incredible. The property had everything the photos promised: a wraparound deck with weathered Adirondack chairs, a private dock stretching into the water, and this view of the lake that looked like something from a postcard. Angela dove straight into organizing the kitchen while I unloaded our SUV, and the kids immediately ran down to explore the dock, their laughter bouncing across the calm water. The whole setup was perfect, exactly what we needed, though the nearest neighbors were barely visible through the trees on either side, and across the lake there was nothing but forest and what looked like a few old structures hidden in the shadows of the opposite shore. After dinner that first night, burgers on this ancient Weber grill that probably came with the house, we were all out on the deck just soaking in the quiet when Tommy grabbed my arm around 9:30. "Dad, someone's playing with flashlights over there," he said, pointing across the dark water to the opposite shore, maybe half a mile away. I saw them immediately, these bright white lights blinking in what seemed like a pattern from somewhere in the tree line on the far side of the lake. My first thought was teenagers messing around, or maybe boaters signaling each other, because Lake Champlain gets pretty busy with recreational traffic during summer months. But Angela was the one who noticed how methodical it was. 3 quick flashes, then this slow, sweeping beam that moved from left to right, followed by 3 more quick flashes, and the whole sequence would repeat. "Probably just kids being kids," I said, though something about the precision of it made me keep watching. The beam, whenever it did that slow sweep across the water, would always end up aimed directly at our deck, lingering there for several seconds like someone was studying us through the darkness before the light would click off completely. We watched for maybe 15 minutes and it never varied. Same exact pattern every time, always ending with that beam trained on our rental house like a finger pointing through the night. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up around 6:30 to find Tommy already on the deck with a bowl of cereal, using the binoculars we'd brought for bird watching to scan the opposite shore. "Trying to see where those lights came from," he told me. And honestly, in the bright morning sun with mist rising off the lake, the whole thing seemed silly, like we'd gotten spooked over nothing. Through the binoculars, I could make out what looked like an old cabin or boathouse partially hidden in the trees across the water, its brown walls almost invisible against the forest, with a small rotting dock that had mostly collapsed into the lake. The place looked abandoned for years. Part of the roof had caved in, and even from this distance you could see vines growing up the sides. I told Tommy it was probably just local kids who knew about the old building and used it as a hangout spot, which made perfect sense in daylight. We spent the rest of Saturday doing normal vacation stuff: swimming, kayaking. Angela read her book on the deck while Lily complained about the weak Wi-Fi signal. By evening, I'd pretty much forgotten about the lights until we were roasting marshmallows around 9 o'clock, and Tommy suddenly dropped his s'more in the fire. "They're back," he whispered, and sure enough, across the black water, the same exact pattern had started up again. This time, I paid closer attention to the timing. Each complete cycle took exactly 45 seconds. I counted it on my watch, and the beam that swept across always moved at the same speed. Mechanical almost, like someone was following a script. Angela wanted to take the kids inside, but I was getting annoyed now because whoever was doing this was clearly trying to freak out the renters, probably some local tradition to mess with tourists. "I'm going to check it out," I told Angela, grabbing a flashlight and heading down to our dock where we had a small aluminum rowboat tied up that came with the rental. She tried to talk me out of it, said we should just call the rental company in the morning, but something about the deliberateness of those lights made me want answers right then. The lake was dead calm, like black glass, and the sound of the oars cutting through the water seemed incredibly loud in the quiet night. As I rowed across, I kept my flashlight off, not wanting to announce my approach, just following the rhythm of those signals that kept repeating their pattern. The closer I got, the more I could see that the lights were coming from that derelict cabin I'd spotted earlier, specifically from what must have been a window on the upper floor. About 100 feet from the opposite shore, the lights suddenly stopped completely, like whoever was operating them had noticed me coming. I beached the rowboat on what was left of the old dock, the wood creaking and bending under my weight in a way that made me test each step before committing to it. Up close, the cabin was in worse shape than it looked from across the lake, windows broken, door hanging off its hinges, and this smell of rot and mildew that hit you like a wall. But what caught my attention immediately were fresh footprints in the mud leading from the water's edge to the cabin's side entrance, and I mean fresh, like someone had walked through here within the last few hours. The door was barely attached, and when I pushed it open with my flashlight, it scraped against the floor with this grinding sound that made me wince. Inside, most of the downstairs was what you'd expect: moldy furniture, collapsed ceiling sections, raccoon droppings everywhere. But then I noticed something that made me stop cold. In the corner, partially hidden under a tarp, was a modern camping setup. A sleeping bag, some canned food, bottles of water, and a portable camp stove that looked recently used. Someone was definitely living here, or at least staying here regularly, and that changed everything about those lights. The narrow stairs to the upper floor were sketchy at best, missing several steps, but I could see light footprints in the dust leading up, so someone had been using them. When I finally made it to the top, using the walls to support myself where the steps were gone, I found myself in what must have been a bedroom once, now mostly empty, except for what I saw by the window. There was a folding table set up with a pair of high-end binoculars, the expensive kind hunters use, pointed directly across the lake at our rental house. Next to them sat a powerful LED flashlight, the kind that can throw a beam for miles, and a notebook that made my chest tighten when I opened it. Page after page of detailed notes about families staying at our rental, dates, number of people, daily routines, when they went to bed, when they woke up, what they did during the day. June 10th to 17. Family of 5, 3 teenagers, father goes for morning jogs at 6 a.m., mother reads on deck afternoons, kids swim until dark. The entries went back months, maybe longer, each one meticulously documenting the habits of whoever rented the lake house. Our family was already there too, started just yesterday. July 21st. Family of 4 arrived 4 p.m., accountant father, license plate RFK 8827. Teacher mother, boy approx 8, girl approx 13, son interested in fishing, daughter stays inside mostly. Whoever wrote this had been watching us from the moment we'd pulled into the driveway. I started photographing the pages with my phone, my fingers trembling as I flipped through more entries. And that's when I found the section that made me want to grab my family and leave immediately. Behind the regular observation notes was a collection of photographs, dozens of them, all taken with a telephoto lens from this very window. Families on the deck, kids playing in the water, people through the windows at night when the house lights made them visible from across the lake. There were photos of a woman in a bathrobe through a bedroom window, a father carrying his sleeping child from the car, teenagers sneaking beers on the dock after their parents went to bed. Some photos had red circles drawn around specific people, mostly children with notes scribbled on the backs. Would trust strangers. Parents inattentive after 10 p.m. Back door left unlocked during day. One photo showed a young boy, maybe 6 years old, circled in red with the note, "Similar to Gregory, same hair, same build, watches cartoons alone in living room 7 to 8 a.m. I didn't know who Gregory was, but the implication made me sick to my stomach. At the bottom of the pile, I found recent pictures from yesterday. Our arrival, Tommy running to the dock, Lily on her phone on the deck, Angela unpacking groceries through the kitchen window. The sound of a boat motor in the distance snapped me back to reality, and when I looked out the window, I could see navigation lights approaching from the north end of the lake, heading in the general direction of this cabin. I grabbed the notebook, and as many photos as I could stuff in my pockets before heading back down those broken stairs, nearly falling twice in my rush. As I reached the bottom floor, I heard the boat engine getting louder, definitely closer now, and through a crack in the wall I could see it was slowing down, angling toward this shore. I ran to my rowboat, pushed off hard, and started rowing back across the lake faster than I'd ever rowed in my life, the aluminum hull slapping against the water with each frantic stroke. Behind me I heard the other boat's engine cut out, followed by the sound of footsteps on that rotten dock, but I didn't look back, just kept pulling those oars until my shoulders burned. When I finally reached our side of the lake, Angela was waiting on our dock with a police flashlight we kept in the kitchen, and I could see she'd already gotten the kids inside. "Pack everything," I told her, breathing hard. "We're leaving tonight." She started to ask questions, but something in my face must have told her this wasn't the time, because she just nodded and ran back to the house. While Angela threw our stuff into bags, I called 911 from the kitchen, trying to explain to the dispatcher that someone had been stalking rental families at this address for months, possibly years. The woman on the phone said she'd send a unit to check it out, but from her tone, I could tell she thought I was overreacting about some local kids pranking tourists. I pulled out my phone to show Angela the photos I'd taken of the notebook pages, and that's when we heard Tommy's voice from upstairs. "Mom, Dad, there's someone in our yard." We both ran to his bedroom window, and there in the moonlight, standing at the tree line about 30 feet from the house, was a figure just watching our house. They weren't trying to hide, weren't moving, just standing there perfectly still like they wanted us to know they were there. I grabbed the police flashlight and shined it directly at them. It was a man, probably mid-40s, wearing regular clothes like jeans and a fleece jacket, with this completely blank expression on his face. The moment the light hit him, he raised his hand in a slow wave, the kind you'd give to a neighbor, then turned and walked calmly back into the woods. Angela already had both kids in the hallway with our bags, and we practically ran to the car, not even bothering to lock the rental house door behind us. We drove 20 minutes before I felt safe enough to pull over and really explain to Angela what I'd found in that cabin, showing her the photos on my phone and the physical pictures I'd grabbed. She called the rental company's emergency line while I talked to the police again, this time getting transferred to a detective who seemed to take things more seriously when I mentioned the detailed surveillance notes and photographs of children. We spent the rest of the night in a Holiday Inn near Burlington, the kids confused but picking up on our fear enough not to ask too many questions. The detective called back around 3 a.m. They'd searched the cabin and found the setup exactly as I'd described it, plus more notebooks in a hidden compartment under the floorboards going back 3 years, thousands of photos, and what looked like plans for something they wouldn't elaborate on over the phone. The man who'd been living there was Walter Briggs, a registered sex offender who'd been off the radar for 2 years after cutting his ankle monitor and disappearing from a halfway house in New Hampshire. They caught him that same night trying to break into another lakefront rental 6 miles north, where a family with 3 young kids was staying. The rental company refunded everything, and apparently launched a whole investigation into their property management, after the detective told them Briggs had been using that abandoned cabin as his observation post for over 2 years, without anyone noticing. We had to go back the next week to give formal statements, and the detective showed us more of what they'd found. Briggs had detailed maps of every rental property on that section of the lake, had somehow gotten access to booking calendars from multiple rental websites, and knew exactly when families with children would be arriving. The Gregory mentioned in those notes was his nephew who drowned in that same lake 15 years earlier, and the psychiatrist who evaluated him said Briggs had been looking for what he called replacement children ever since his sister cut off contact after the drowning, which she blamed him for. The most disturbing part was finding out that 3 families who'd rented that same house in the past 2 years had reported strange incidents, missing items, toys moved around the yard at night, windows they swore they'd locked found open in the morning. One family even filed a report about their 8-year-old daughter talking about a nice man who'd given her candy by the dock while her parents were inside making lunch, but they never found anyone, and the girl couldn't explain where the man had gone. We never went back to Lake Champlain, and honestly, I can't even look at vacation rental sites without feeling sick. Tommy still has nightmares sometimes about the lights across the water, and Lily won't stay anywhere that doesn't have neighbors close by. The detective called me 6 months later to let me know Briggs had been sentenced to 25 years. They'd found enough evidence in that cabin to charge him with multiple counts of stalking, criminal surveillance, and attempted kidnapping based on those detailed plans they'd discovered. He told me we were lucky, that our decision to leave immediately probably prevented something terrible, though he wouldn't go into specifics about what they thought Briggs had been planning for our family. What haunts me most is thinking about all those families over the years who stayed in that rental house, completely unaware that someone was watching them through high-powered binoculars, documenting their every move, waiting for the perfect opportunity that, thankfully, never came. The rental house was pulled from all the vacation sites after that summer, and last I heard the owners were trying to sell it, though I can't imagine anyone local would buy it knowing its history. Sometimes I still dream about that mechanical pattern of lights across dark water, and I wake up wondering how many other Walter Briggs are out there, sitting in abandoned buildings with notebooks and cameras, watching families who think they're just enjoying a peaceful vacation. I had been living in Milwaukee with my girlfriend Claire when we stumbled on the listing for that foreclosed lake house. It was tucked away in Wisconsin, far from the noise of the city, and the photos made it look like the perfect fixer-upper. We didn't have much money, but the price was too good to ignore. Our idea was simple: put in the work, renovate it ourselves, and turn it into a summer rental that could eventually cover the mortgage. At the time, life felt like it was finally moving in the right direction. Claire was working part-time as a graphic designer, and I was juggling shifts at a hardware store, so the thought of owning property, by a lake no less, felt unreal. The first weekend after we closed, we packed the car with cleaning supplies, sleeping bags, and enough food to last a couple of days. The drive was longer than we expected, the kind that makes you question whether you took the wrong exit somewhere. By the time we reached the house, the sun was dipping low, painting the water in shades of gray and silver. From the outside, the place looked neglected but not hopeless. Faded shutters, chipped paint, overgrown weeds. But beneath all that, you could see the bones of a once-loved family retreat. Claire said it reminded her of the kind of houses her grandparents would rent for fishing trips, and I agreed. It had charm, even if buried under years of neglect. We spent most of that first day dusting, sweeping, and throwing out junk left behind by the previous owners. Old beer cans under the porch, cracked dishes stacked in the cupboards, water-damaged magazines scattered across the living room. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Every now and then, we'd pause, imagining how we'd repaint the walls or where we'd set up the fire pit outside. The strangest part, though, was how quiet it was. Even with the lake stretching out behind the house, the air felt heavy, like sound didn't travel far out there. I remember standing in the kitchen with the window open and realizing I couldn't hear a single bird. Late in the afternoon, while dragging a box of yellowed curtains toward the trash pile, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. It was at the back of the hallway, half hidden behind a shelving unit stacked with old paint cans. The handle was rusted, the frame warped, and when I tried it, the door wouldn't budge. At first, I thought it was just swollen wood, the kind that sticks after years of humidity. But the more I pushed, the more it felt deliberate, like it wasn't meant to open. Claire came over, wiping sweat from her forehead, and asked what I was doing. When I pointed it out, she frowned. "Was that on the floor plan?" she asked. I shook my head. Neither of us remembered any mention of a basement in the listing. It took us nearly an hour to drag the shelving unit out of the way and pry the door open. The wood splintered around the hinges, and when it finally gave, a blast of damp, stale air poured out. A set of narrow stairs descended into darkness, the kind that swallowed the beam of my flashlight as soon as I flicked it on. Claire hesitated at the top, hugging her arms, but I felt pulled down by curiosity. Each step creaked under my weight, the air thick with mildew and something metallic, almost like pennies left to rot in water. When the light finally cut through the gloom, my excitement drained. The basement stretched wider than I expected, and along the walls stood rows of cots, rusted frames, thin-stained mattresses, and chains bolted into the concrete beside them. Claire whispered my name, her voice thin and tight, as if speaking too loudly would wake something. I walked deeper, kicking aside empty bottles and scraps of clothing that looked decades old. Shoes, children's backpacks, even a cracked plastic lunchbox with faded cartoon stickers still clinging to the side. None of it made sense. It wasn't just storage. It looked like people had been kept down here. I kept turning in slow circles, the flashlight beam bouncing across the walls, until it caught on something that made me stop. A section of the floor scarred with deep scratches, as if someone had dragged heavy furniture or tried to claw their way across the concrete. That image stuck with me, and for the first time since we bought the place, I wanted nothing more than to leave. We didn't say much after that. We climbed out of the basement in silence, shut the door as best we could, and pushed the shelving unit back in front of it. Neither of us wanted to sit with the questions that were now screaming in our heads. Who built that basement like that? Why wasn't it mentioned in the listing? And whose belongings had been left behind? Claire suggested calling the realtor, but it was late, and I just wanted to eat something and crash on the couch. We tried to carry on as if it was just another weird discovery in an old house, but the unease clung to us like a bad smell. Even while cooking dinner, I kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting the door to creak open on its own. That night, we set up our sleeping bags in the living room since the bedrooms still needed work. The house was eerily still, only the faint lapping of the lake against the shore seeping through the windows. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of crunching gravel outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon rummaging near the trash. But then I saw Claire sitting up, wide-eyed, staring toward the curtains. The crunching wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, like footsteps circling the house. I held my breath, straining to listen, and realized whoever it was had stopped in the yard, just beyond the window. The curtain swayed slightly, and for the first time all day, I wished we had never bought the place. I whispered to Claire not to move, and we both stayed completely still. Minutes passed, but the presence outside didn't fade. Then came the unmistakable sound of the back gate creaking open. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They were on the property. I grabbed the heavy flashlight we had left near the couch and edged toward the window, careful not to step on the squeaky floorboard by the door. Through a tiny gap in the curtain, I saw a figure moving across the yard, carrying something long and metallic. The weak glow from the porch light caught just enough detail. A crowbar. Panic surged through me. Claire reached for her phone, but there was no signal this far out. We hadn't thought to hook up Wi-Fi yet. The only option was to stay quiet and hope whoever it was left on their own. But then the figure stopped near the basement window, crouching as if inspecting it. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it filled the whole room. I imagined them realizing the door upstairs had been forced and deciding to come inside to check what we had seen. The thought of confronting whoever used that basement for God knows what nearly made me sick. I motioned for Claire to follow me, and we slipped toward the front door. The hinges screeched faintly as I opened it, and I prayed the intruder hadn't heard. Barefoot, we sprinted down the gravel driveway, not daring to look back, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the ground. My car was parked just off the road, and fumbling with the keys felt like it took forever. When the engine finally roared to life, Claire begged me to just drive. Anywhere. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure had turned from the basement and now stood in the yard, facing the house, completely still. We didn't stop until we reached the next town over, where we parked in the lot of a 24-hour diner. Neither of us could get the words out at first, Eventually, we called the county sheriff and reported what we'd found, along with the man on the property. By the time deputies went out there, the house was empty. They never found the intruder, and when they searched the basement, all the belongings, cots, and chains had been cleared out. To this day, I don't understand how someone emptied that place so quickly or why it was hidden in the first place. All I know is, we never went back and the lake house is still standing there, probably holding secrets I never want to uncover.